You can live your whole life thinking you're free, only to die realizing you spent it in a cage built from other people's beliefs. Most of us walk through life with borrowed thoughts. We inherit ideas about good and evil, reality and illusion, even life and death, without ever asking why. But history is filled with thinkers who did ask why, and their answers were disturbing, shocking, sometimes even dangerous. In the next 3 hours, we're diving headfirst into the most bizarre, unsettling, and profound philosophies ever conceived. Ideas so radical they challenged empires, disturbed religions, and reshaped the human mind itself. If you're tired of surface-level thinking and ready to question everything you thought you knew, this is your journey. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which philosopher you'd like to explore next. Morality is a weapon used by the weak to control the strong. This idea, largely born from the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, turns conventional ethical thinking on its head. Most people think of morality as a universal set of principles, guidelines for good behavior that help society function. But Nietzsche proposed something far more unsettling, that morality, especially the dominant moral systems in the West, is a psychological strategy developed by the powerless to manipulate and restrain those with power. To understand this, Nietzsche breaks morality into two major types: master morality and slave morality. Master morality originates from those who see themselves as powerful, noble, and life-affirming. In this system, what is good is what expresses strength, vitality, courage, and excellence. Bad is simply the absence of these traits: weakness, cowardice, mediocrity. It's not evil, just lesser. Slave morality, on the other hand, is born from resentment, what Nietzsche called ressentiment. It comes from those who lack power and cannot assert themselves directly. These individuals, unable to dominate or rise above their condition, develop a value system that flips the master's values upside down. In slave morality, humility, obedience, meekness, and suffering become good. Meanwhile, strength, ambition, and self-assertion are condemned as evil. Morality becomes an act of revenge, a way to morally shame and restrain the powerful. This is not just a philosophical abstraction. Nietzsche believed Christianity, for example, is the ultimate expression of slave morality. The Christian exaltation of poverty, turning the other cheek, and self-sacrifice is, in his view, a clever inversion, transforming weakness into virtue and strength into sin. The crucified figure of Christ becomes the symbolic triumph of the weak over the strong, not through power, but through moral guilt. Nietzsche argued that such morality doesn't elevate humanity. It suppresses it. It teaches people to hate life, to deny their instincts, to reject what is vital and passionate in favor of self-denial and obedience. It rewards suffering, not excellence. In this view, morality isn't a neutral guide for right and wrong. It's a battlefield. It's a system of control. And here's the twist. It works. Slave morality succeeded. The majority of people in modern societies follow moral systems based on compassion, humility, and equality. But Nietzsche's concern wasn't compassion itself. It was the suppression of human potential in the name of leveling the playing field. He feared a future where no one dares to be exceptional because it might make others feel less than. So when Nietzsche says morality is a weapon used by the weak, he isn't dismissing all ethics. He's pointing to how moral systems can be tools of power, not just among the strong, but among the weak who master guilt, shame, and victimhood. These tools are subtle but effective, working not through force, but through the internalization of control. Ultimately, this idea challenges us to ask uncomfortable questions. Are the values we hold truly our own? Or were they planted in us by those who benefit from our obedience? Is morality lifting us up or holding us down? And who exactly profits from the moral codes we're told to follow? Suffering isn't a curse, it's the core of existence. This provocative idea sits at the very heart of Arthur Schopenhauer's philosophy and resonates through the darker veins of Nietzsche's early thought. It doesn't just challenge our modern desire for comfort and happiness, it completely redefines the role of pain in the human condition. Schopenhauer begins with a bold premise, that the fundamental force driving all life is the will, an unconscious, blind striving that underlies everything from the growth of plants to human ambition. But this will is never satisfied. The moment we fulfill one desire, another emerges. This endless cycle of longing, fulfillment, and renewed longing traps us in perpetual restlessness. And what do we experience in that gap between desire and satisfaction? Suffering. For Schopenhauer, suffering is not an anomaly. It is the default state. When we are hungry, we suffer. When we eat, we briefly feel relief, only to grow bored or develop new cravings. Even pleasure, he argued, is merely the temporary absence of pain, not a state in itself, but a fleeting break in a constant storm. In his view, pain is more intense, more present, and more fundamental than pleasure. And the will ensures that we are always lacking something, always reaching, always hurting. This might sound deeply pessimistic, and it is. Schopenhauer believed that the more conscious a being is, the more it suffers. Animals may feel hunger or fear, but humans feel regret, dread, and existential despair. Our intelligence, our self-awareness, only amplify our suffering. We remember the past. We anticipate future pain. We worry about meaning, identity, mortality. The curse of the human mind is that it sees its own doom coming and can do nothing to stop it. Yet Schopenhauer didn't just wallow in this bleakness. He also saw potential paths of escape, or at least relief. One was through aesthetic experience, the contemplation of beauty, especially through art and music. In these moments, we step outside the restless will, even if only for a short time. Another was compassion, which he considered the only true moral impulse, since when we recognize the suffering of others, we see a reflection of our own. Nietzsche took this idea of suffering and twisted it into a new form. While Schopenhauer sought to escape suffering, Nietzsche embraced it. He saw suffering as the raw material of greatness. To Nietzsche, the most profound individuals, the artists, the heroes, the creators, are those who suffer deeply but transform their pain into strength, meaning, and expression. In his famous concept of amor fati, the love of fate, Nietzsche suggests we must not merely endure suffering, but love it. To affirm life is to affirm suffering, because without it, there is no growth, no depth, no real joy. Modern culture teaches us to avoid pain at all costs, through medication, distraction, entertainment. But this philosophy tells us something different. Suffering is not the enemy. It's the very texture of being alive. Without it, there is no desire, no striving, no transcendence. The human condition is forged in pain, not in comfort. And maybe, just maybe, those who understand this, who stop fleeing suffering and begin to confront it, are the ones who come closest to something real. Truth is just a power play in disguise. This unsettling idea comes from the heart of Michel Foucault's philosophy, and it undermines everything we typically believe about knowledge, science, morality, and even common sense. It challenges the modern notion that truth is objective, timeless, and above politics. Instead, Foucault argues that what we call truth is often the product of systems of power, carefully constructed and maintained to control behavior, define reality, and preserve authority. To understand this, you need to see how Foucault viewed knowledge and power as inseparable. In traditional thinking, knowledge is something pure. It exists to uncover facts about the world, help people make informed decisions and gradually bring us closer to the truth. But Foucault believed that knowledge is never neutral. It's always tied to who gets to speak, who is believed, and who gets silenced. Take, for example, the history of medicine. In the Middle Ages, madness was often treated with superstition or religious rituals. Then, in the Enlightenment, institutions rose up: mental asylums, hospitals, and medical schools. Alongside them came new truths about what it meant to be insane, abnormal, or deviant. But those truths didn't just emerge from scientific discovery. They were shaped by who held power: physicians, bureaucrats, and legal systems, and used to define who was normal and who needed to be corrected, confined, or cured. In short, truth was designed to serve the needs of the system. Foucault called this dynamic regimes of truth. These are not conspiracies. They are the subtle networks of discourse, institutions, and practices that define what is considered true at any given time. For example, in one era it may be true that kings rule by divine right. In another, it may be true that humans are rational consumers. These truths seem natural until they're not. Each shift in truth represents a shift in power. This doesn't mean that facts don't exist or that everything is just opinion, but it does mean that how we interpret facts, what questions we're allowed to ask, and which answers are accepted as valid, all of that is shaped by power structures. Foucault even challenged the idea of the author as a source of meaning. He argued that meaning is produced in systems, not by individuals, and that what we call truth is often a reflection of who gets to define reality. Take the prison system. Foucault showed how the rise of surveillance and discipline wasn't just about punishment. It was about creating a certain kind of obedient subject. Truths about criminality, deviance, and correction weren't simply scientific. They served political functions. They reinforced control. Even education, which we often associate with the noble pursuit of truth, is implicated. Schools don't just transmit knowledge. They normalize behavior, reward compliance, and sort individuals into roles. The truth that education is purely a public good can obscure the ways it functions as a mechanism of power. In this view, seeking truth is never separate from navigating power. The question isn't just, is this true, but who benefits from this truth? Who is allowed to define it, and what does it silence? Foucault's warning is not that we should abandon truth, but that we should always look behind it, because often the ones holding the truth are also holding the leash. You are not an individual. You are a construct of social systems. It sounds offensive to our modern ears, especially in a world that glorifies self-expression, identity, and personal freedom. But this idea, shaped largely by Michel Foucault and other post-structuralist thinkers, forces us to look at the self not as something natural or innate, but as something produced, not discovered but designed, by forces most of us never notice. From the moment you're born, you're given a name, a gender, a nationality, a family structure. You're placed in systems, education, religion, law, healthcare, that all come with expectations. These systems don't just shape your experiences, they shape how you think about yourself. Who you believe you are, what you consider normal, even what you imagine is possible. All of this is filtered through social structures and institutions. Foucault described how power doesn't just repress, it produces. Power doesn't only tell you what you can't do, it tells you who you are. For example, think about the concept of sexuality. We often imagine sexual orientation as a deeply personal, internal truth. But Foucault argued that our very understanding of heterosexual, homosexual, normal, deviant, or even identity itself was constructed by scientific, legal, and medical discourses in the 19th century. Before that, people engaged in acts, but were not defined by them, Once systems began to categorize people based on behavior, new selves were born. Suddenly, society didn't just say, "You did this." It said, "This is who you are." The same goes for mental health. Modern psychology, psychiatry, and therapy have invented whole categories of personhood: anxious, depressed, bipolar, ADHD, borderline, and so on. These labels can help us understand suffering, yes, but they also come with scripts, expectations, even social roles. And those scripts shape how people view themselves and how others treat them. In effect, institutions don't just diagnose, they create identities. Even your sense of free will is up for debate. The choices you think you're making independently are often pre-scripted by culture. What clothes you wear, what job you aspire to, what counts as success. None of these are neutral. They are offered to you by your environment. You are guided by language, trends, norms, and unseen pressures. You didn't choose your values in a vacuum. They were taught to you. This is why Foucault emphasized the role of discourse, the invisible web of language, ideas, and institutions that make some ways of being visible and others impossible. The self is a product of these discourses. Who you are is shaped by what society allows you to be, and that can change. A century ago, people didn't identify as non-binary or introverts or neurodivergent. These identities didn't exist because the systems that define and validate them weren't in place. This isn't to say you have no agency, but the agency you have operates within a structure that you didn't build. You didn't choose your language, your laws, your categories of thought. You inherited them. The idea of the isolated, autonomous individual, completely self-made, is a cultural fiction. The truth is more complicated and more unsettling. You are not outside the system. You are the system, reflected back at itself. God is dead, and we killed him. This is perhaps Friedrich Nietzsche's most infamous declaration, and also one of the most misunderstood. When Nietzsche wrote, "God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him," he wasn't celebrating atheism, nor was he suggesting a literal assassination. What he meant was far more philosophical and more unsettling. He was diagnosing a crisis in Western culture, the slow collapse of religious belief, moral certainty, and divine authority in the modern age. For centuries, belief in God structured how people understood the world. Morality, meaning, order, and even identity were anchored in a divine framework. God was not just a figure of worship. He was the foundation of truth, the reason for being, the ultimate judge and protector. But with the rise of science, secularism, and modern skepticism, that foundation began to crumble. The Enlightenment had made belief optional. Darwin had made creation debatable, and Nietzsche saw where it was all heading, to a cultural vacuum. By saying we killed him, Nietzsche was pointing the finger at society. We, through reason, philosophy, and science, dismantled the old worldviews. But we didn't fully grasp what we had done. We destroyed the foundation of meaning without replacing it. And this, Nietzsche warned, would leave a terrifying void. Without God, there is no divine law, no absolute good or evil, no cosmic justice, just existence, raw and indifferent. Nietzsche's concern was not theological, it was existential. He saw the death of God as triggering a profound moral crisis. Without a higher authority, how would people define right and wrong? What would stop nihilism from taking over? If nothing is sacred, if life has no divine purpose, why do anything at all? And yet, Nietzsche wasn't nostalgic. He didn't want to go back to blind faith. Instead, he saw the death of God as a dangerous but necessary turning point. It forced humanity to confront the full weight of its freedom. No longer could we lean on divine commandments. We had to create values for ourselves. In his words, we had to become the legislators of meaning. This is where Nietzsche introduces the idea of the Übermensch, or Overman Ra, the one who rises above the ruins of old morality to create new values rooted in life, power, and creativity. The Overman is not bound by guilt or shame. He affirms existence on his own terms. He is a response to the void, a human being strong enough to carry the burden of meaning. But Nietzsche also knew this transformation wouldn't come easily. Most people, he believed, weren't ready. They would cling to old moralities, fall into nihilism, or seek new idols to worship, ideologies, nationalism, consumerism. In fact, much of the 20th century, with its violent extremes, can be read as a struggle to fill the void Nietzsche foresaw. So when we hear God is dead, we should not hear a triumphant cry. We should hear a warning, a recognition that the scaffolding that once held up our worldview is gone. And now the responsibility to build meaning falls squarely on us. Free will is an illusion. We're driven by blind, irrational forces. The belief in free will is one of the most cherished in Western culture. It's the cornerstone of morality, justice, and personal responsibility. If you make a choice, it's your choice. You could have done otherwise. But thinkers like Arthur Schopenhauer and later Nietzsche and Foucault shattered this comforting narrative. They argued that what we call free will is largely a myth. Instead, we are driven by forces we neither understand nor control. Schopenhauer put it bluntly, "You can do what you will, but you cannot will what you will." In other words, your decisions may feel free, but the desires and impulses that gave rise to those decisions are not freely chosen. They're born from your biology, your temperament, your environment, your conditioning. The moment you think, "I want to do this," you've already been moved by something deeper, something unconscious, primal, even irrational. He described this force as the will to life, a blind, ceaseless striving that underpins all living things. It drives survival, reproduction, ambition, and conflict. You are not a rational agent who weighs every option with clarity. You are a vessel of the will, swept along by needs and cravings you rarely examine. Your mind then builds justifications for decisions already made by something deeper. Nietzsche took this further. He believed that what we call rationality is often a cover story for deeper instincts, especially the will to power. Human beings don't seek truth, he argued. They seek advantage. They act out of fear, hunger, desire, and resentment, then build narratives to make those actions appear noble or reasoned. This is why he was skeptical of both moral philosophy and religion. They often mask deeper drives with the illusion of freedom and virtue. Modern neuroscience has only deepened this critique. Studies show that decisions can be detected in the brain before we are consciously aware of them. Your brain lights up with activity milliseconds before you choose. In many ways, your sense of freedom might just be your mind catching up to what your body and unconscious brain have already decided. And yet this doesn't mean humans are robots. Foucault would say we are shaped by structures, power, language, discourse, institutions. These shape how we think, what options we perceive, and what choices we believe are available. You don't choose in a vacuum. You choose from within a carefully curated set of possibilities. Your freedom is managed. What we're left with is sobering. The idea that much of what we experience as conscious decision-making is actually the tip of a deep, chaotic iceberg. Beneath it lies a storm of instincts, traumas, desires, social pressures, and unconscious programming. Free will in this view is less a fact and more a feeling, an illusion that lets society run smoothly and lets us sleep at night. Institutions like prisons and schools are factories of obedience. Michel Foucault didn't see schools, prisons, hospitals, or even military barracks as neutral buildings designed to serve the public good. He saw them as engines of power, machineries built to produce a certain kind of human being, disciplined, docile, and obedient. In Discipline and Punish, Foucault traces how Western societies transitioned from punishing the body, public executions, torture, branding, to controlling the mind and behavior. This was not because society became more humane, but because it became more efficient. It realized that obedience was more valuable than spectacle. Power moved from the visible to the invisible. Prisons became a model. They didn't just lock people up, they broke them down. Through surveillance, routine, isolation, and evaluation, they reshaped the individual. The prisoner wasn't simply punished, they were trained. And once you perfect this system of control in a prison, you can export it everywhere. Schools adopted many of the same methods: strict schedules, bells, standardized testing, grading systems, surveillance by teachers. These aren't just tools for education, they're tools for discipline. The student is conditioned to sit still, raise their hand, follow rules, and internalize authority. Just like the prisoner, they are made legible, trackable, and controllable. Even architecture reflects this. The Panopticon, a circular prison where inmates can be watched without knowing whether they're being watched, became Foucault's metaphor for modern society. You don't need chains if people believe they're always being observed. This self-surveillance leads to internalized control. You behave as if someone's watching, even when they aren't. That's efficient power. Hospitals, military camps, even corporate offices follow similar patterns. People are categorized, documented, evaluated. The system rewards compliance and punishes deviation, not always harshly, but consistently. It doesn't crush rebellion. It renders rebellion unthinkable. Foucault didn't deny that these institutions provide real benefits. Education, public health, safety, these matter. But he insisted we look at how those benefits are delivered and what kind of person they produce. We say we value creativity and independence, yet we build institutions that reward conformity and submission. This lens forces us to question, are we educating, healing, and protecting people, or are we managing them? Are we building minds or manufacturing obedience? Pity is poisonous. It feeds weakness. Friedrich Nietzsche had no patience for pity. To him, pity wasn't a virtue. It was a sickness. It encouraged weakness, rewarded failure, and dragged the strong down to the level of the suffering. In his eyes, modern morality, especially Christian morality, had elevated pity into a central value. And this, he believed, was a catastrophic mistake. Pity, for Nietzsche, was not the same as compassion or empathy. Those emotions, he thought, could involve understanding someone's struggle without collapsing into their pain. But pity? Pity was condescending. It made the one who suffered feel smaller, and it robbed them of dignity. Worse, it allowed the person feeling pity to elevate themselves as morally superior. Nietzsche saw the glorification of suffering as a cultural disease. He argued that people had come to associate suffering with virtue. The more one suffered, especially silently, nobly, the more good they were considered. This inversion of values was, in his view, the triumph of slave morality, a morality born from weakness, not strength. In ancient aristocratic cultures, strength, power, and achievement were considered noble. But over time, the oppressed and powerless developed their own moral system, one that flipped the values of their masters. Instead of praising strength, they praised meekness. Instead of admiring power, they glorified humility. This morality of the weak eventually overtook society and, Nietzsche believed, turned greatness into guilt. Pity plays a central role in this shift. It becomes a weapon, used by the weak to manipulate the strong. Instead of rising above their condition, those who suffer now demand recognition for their pain. They gain moral authority through victimhood. This doesn't encourage transformation. It reinforces helplessness. Nietzsche's goal wasn't to abandon all care for others, but he believed that true love for humanity should be life-affirming, not life-denying. It should encourage strength, growth, and self-overcoming, not freeze people in their suffering. Instead of teaching people to wallow in misery and expect moral praise for it, society should challenge individuals to become stronger, more self-reliant, more heroic. In modern culture, Nietzsche would likely see the celebration of victim narratives and identity-based suffering as symptoms of this same disease. While acknowledging pain is essential, he would ask, does this acknowledgement inspire resilience, or does it encourage dependency? Does it liberate or enslave? To Nietzsche, greatness requires suffering, yes, but not the kind that seeks pity, the kind that builds, the kind that transforms, the kind that fuels the ascent toward what he called the Übermensch, the higher individual who creates their own values and affirms life even in its darkest moments. Sexuality is constructed, not natural. Michel Foucault's groundbreaking work, The History of Sexuality, reshaped how we understand desire, identity, and the body. He challenged a basic assumption that sexuality is something natural, fixed, and biologically determined. Instead, he argued, sexuality is socially constructed, a product of history, language, power, and discourse. In earlier times, sexuality wasn't about identity. People engaged in sexual acts, but they weren't categorized by them. A man who had sex with other men wasn't homosexual. He was just someone who did certain things. It wasn't until the 19th century that scientific, legal, and moral systems began to classify people based on their sexual behavior. This moment marked the birth of what Foucault called the sexual subject. People began to internalize labels like heterosexual, homosexual, pervert, normal. These weren't just descriptive, they were prescriptive. They shaped how people saw themselves and others. They created norms, boundaries, and categories that didn't exist before. What drove this change? Foucault argues it wasn't a loosening of sexual repression, but the expansion of surveillance and control. Victorian society didn't silence sexuality. It obsessed over it. Doctors, priests, teachers, and bureaucrats all developed systems for observing, documenting, and regulating sexual behavior. Power didn't repress sexuality. It produced it as a field of knowledge and identity. Sexuality, then, is not a raw biological fact. It's a complex social invention. What is considered normal or deviant shifts across cultures and centuries. Ancient Greeks had different attitudes toward same-sex relations. Other cultures recognize third genders or view sexuality as fluid rather than fixed. The idea that sexuality is essential and immutable is a modern Western construct. Foucault's message wasn't that desire is fake, but that how we understand and organize it is deeply influenced by power. Even today, debates around sexuality are less about biology and more about control. Who gets to define what is acceptable, who can express desire freely, and who must be silenced. This challenges us to rethink not only our categories, but also the institutions, schools, churches, governments that reinforce them. Foucault doesn't offer easy answers. He urges us to question the frameworks we take for granted, and to recognize that identity, even in its most intimate forms, is shaped by the systems we live in. Art is the only escape from the horror of being. Arthur Schopenhauer believed that life, at its core, is suffering. Driven by an irrational, insatiable will to life, human beings are trapped in a cycle of desire and disappointment. Pleasure is fleeting. Pain is constant. Even moments of happiness are just brief pauses in an otherwise restless existence. But in this bleak landscape, Schopenhauer saw one possible refuge: art. Art for Schopenhauer is not entertainment. It's a moment of transcendence. When we experience great music, painting, literature, or architecture, we temporarily step outside the torment of the will. We stop wanting, craving, and fearing. Instead, we contemplate. We become, as he put it, a pure, will-less subject of knowledge. Unlike everyday experiences that are driven by ego and desire, artistic experience allows us to lose ourselves. In that moment, we're no longer the suffering individual chasing satisfaction. We become observers of timeless beauty. Art offers us access to a deeper reality, a world beyond striving. Schopenhauer held music in especially high regard. He believed it expressed the purest essence of the will, without concepts, without representation. Music doesn't just describe emotion. It is emotion. It bypasses language and speaks directly to the inner depths of the soul. In this way, it offers the most profound escape. But this escape is temporary. Art doesn't cure suffering, it pauses it. That's why Schopenhauer also saw value in the aesthetic life, a life devoted to contemplation, art, and renunciation. The artist, the poet, the philosopher, they aren't just creators, they are resistors. They fight back against the tyranny of the will through beauty. This idea influenced Nietzsche, Wagner, and countless modern thinkers. It also speaks to something deeply human. In a world where pain is unavoidable, art gives us meaning. It gives us distance. It allows us to say, yes, this is unbearable, but it is also beautiful. Madness isn't the opposite of reason. Sometimes it's more real. Michel Foucault's Madness and Civilization isn't just a history of psychiatry. It's a bold claim that what society calls madness is often a social invention, not an objective illness. That madness, at different points in history, wasn't treated as the absence of reason, but as a form of truth too powerful, too disturbing, or too inconvenient to be tolerated. In medieval Europe, the mad were often seen as touched by the divine or by cosmic forces. They were not always locked away. They walked among society, sometimes revered, sometimes feared, but not yet institutionalized. It wasn't until the Enlightenment, the so-called Age of Reason, that madness became the enemy of rationality. Foucault tracks how, beginning in the 17th and 18th centuries, the mad were systematically confined in hospitals and asylums. This wasn't just for treatment, it was for control. Madness was now seen as dangerous, irrational, deviant. The reasonable state had no room for it, so it was silenced. But here's the twist. Foucault suggests that madness reveals something essential about human nature. The mad person, unchained from logic and order, exposes the fragile boundaries of what we call sanity. Madness isn't outside the system. It's what the system must repress to maintain itself. It's the dark mirror of reason. He shows how psychiatry became a tool, not of healing, but of normalization. It didn't just treat people. It defined what a person should be. And anyone outside that definition? Medicated, confined, labeled. Madness, in this view, isn't less real. It's too real. It threatens the illusion of order. The self is just a shifting web of influences and power. The modern world loves the idea of a solid, stable self. It tells us to find ourselves, be ourselves, and express our true selves. But Michel Foucault throws cold water on this idea. He argued that the self is not some internal, authentic core. It is a construct, constantly shaped and reshaped by the systems of power and knowledge around us. Your identity, your personality, even your desires, none of these arise from a pure, untouched inner space. They are products of language, institutions, social norms, media, education, religion, psychology, and culture. The self is not discovered. It is assembled. Foucault traced how different historical periods produced different kinds of subjects. In the classical age, the self was a soul under God's eye. In the Enlightenment, it became a rational citizen. In the modern era, the self became an object of science, measurable, diagnosable, and correctable. Each version of the self fits the needs of its time. This idea dismantles the notion of autonomy. We like to think we choose who we are, but in truth, our choices are shaped by what society has already made visible, acceptable, and thinkable. The you that you believe in is part of a script, one that's been written across history. Human nature is mostly will to dominate or be dominated. Friedrich Nietzsche didn't believe in a fixed, peaceful, cooperative human nature. He believed in the will to power, a fundamental force that drives every living being, not just to survive, but to overcome, conquer, and assert. This drive is deeper than morality, deeper than reason. It shapes everything from personal ambition to empires to ideologies. In Nietzsche's view, people don't seek truth for its own sake. They seek control. Even love and kindness can mask a desire to possess or influence. Every interaction involves a subtle balance of domination and submission, whether it's in politics, art, religion, or even relationships. This doesn't mean everyone becomes a tyrant, but it means the will to power expresses itself differently in different people. Some dominate through charisma, others through intellect, martyrdom, even victimhood. The meek don't escape the power game, they just play it from a different position. Nietzsche believed that acknowledging this truth is essential. Hiding behind false humility or moral posturing only leads to resentment and weakness. True strength comes from embracing your own will and directing it creatively, not destructively. Power, in this view, is not evil. It is life itself. How you use it defines who you are. Time doesn't heal, it just buries the truth. The idea that time heals all wounds is deeply ingrained in our culture. It's something we say to people in grief, to victims of betrayal, or even to ourselves after regret. But philosophy challenges this with a darker and more unsettling possibility. Time doesn't heal, it just buries the truth. Nietzsche believed that forgetting was an essential function of human survival. He wrote that humans have to forget in order to move forward, to live productively. But this forgetting isn't healing. It's a suppression, a convenient fading of memory that helps individuals and societies continue functioning without ever confronting their deepest traumas. Time allows pain to slip into the background, not because it has been resolved, but because we have developed mechanisms of avoidance. On a personal level, we often say we're over something simply because it no longer haunts us every day. But unresolved pain doesn't vanish. It migrates. It becomes bitterness, resentment, anxiety, or a hardening of the heart. It may emerge in dreams, in relationships, or in the quiet discontent that defines so many lives. Psychologically, trauma that's not processed doesn't disappear. It lodges in the unconscious, waiting to surface again under stress or repetition. Foucault, examining this idea at a societal level, would argue that time is often used as a tool by power to erase and reshape memory. Cultures don't move on from historical atrocities. They overwrite them. The more time that passes, the more opportunities there are for revision, rebranding, and sanitization. For instance, colonization is often remembered in textbooks as exploration or development. Slavery is sometimes framed as a chapter that ended with liberation rather than a wound that continues through systemic racism. This process of historical amnesia is not accidental. It serves those in power by replacing truth with narrative. Monuments go up. Museums curate sanitized versions of events. National holidays distract from original crimes. Over time, a new truth emerges, not from honesty, but from repetition. Even in interpersonal relationships, time often makes people rewrite what happened. Someone who caused pain may say, "That was so long ago," as if time alone should erase accountability. The injured party may feel pressured to forgive, not because they've healed, but because they've been told it's time to let it go. So while time does give emotional distance, that distance isn't resolution. It's often a graveyard of unspoken truths and neglected wounds. Real healing requires confrontation, bringing the truth into the light, sitting with it, and integrating it. Time left on its own buries it instead. Life has no inherent meaning, it's all projection. The idea that life has no inherent meaning is both liberating and terrifying. Philosophers like Arthur Schopenhauer, Friedrich Nietzsche, and later Jean-Paul Sartre tackled this existential void head-on. They didn't believe life came with pre-written significance. Instead, they argued that any meaning we experience is something we project onto life, not something we find hidden within it. Schopenhauer viewed life as fundamentally driven by a blind, irrational force he called the will to life. This force is not conscious. It doesn't care about meaning or fulfillment. It simply strives, to eat, to survive, to reproduce. Human beings, he believed, are not guided by reason, but by this relentless will. We suffer because we constantly crave things, pleasure, love, success. But satisfaction is always temporary. The moment one desire is met, another appears. Life becomes an endless cycle of longing and disappointment. In this bleak worldview, meaning is not embedded in the universe. It is fabricated by human beings in an effort to cope. Religion, art, philosophy, patriotism, these are not reflections of truth, but psychological defenses against the absurdity of existence. Nietzsche took a more active approach to the same dilemma. He declared that God is dead, not in a theological sense, but in a cultural one. The divine order that gave people meaning for centuries was collapsing under science, secularism, and modern skepticism. Without God, the universe has no author, and thus no script. The terrifying result is that we are left alone in a meaningless world. But Nietzsche didn't see this as pure despair. He saw it as an opportunity. If life has no inherent meaning, then we are free to create our own. This is where the concept of the Übermensch, or overman, comes in. A person who doesn't rely on external systems for purpose, but forges their own path through strength, creativity, and personal vision. Sartre would echo this in the 20th century with existentialism. He said, "Existence precedes essence. We exist first, and only later define who we are." Meaning is not something waiting to be discovered. It's something we create through choices, responsibility, and action. This philosophy has deep psychological consequences. It means that our search for purpose is not about uncovering a hidden truth. It's about crafting a story powerful enough to carry us through the chaos. And this crafting is deeply personal. Two people can live identical lives, and one may find it meaningful while the other finds it empty. Why? Because the meaning isn't in the life, it's in the projection. So when people ask, "What's the meaning of life?" the unsettling answer from this school of thought is, whatever you can live with. History is written not by truth, but by dominance. The way we remember the past is rarely a reflection of objective truth. Michel Foucault argued that history is not a record of facts, but a narrative carefully sculpted by those who hold power. It's not that history lies, it's that it selects, it frames, it erases. In doing so, it transforms domination into legitimacy. Foucault's idea of power and knowledge is central here. He believed that knowledge is not separate from power. It is a form of it. Those who control the present have the tools to shape how the past is remembered. They determine what is archived, what is taught, and what is commemorated. Think about colonization. The dominant narrative often speaks of discovery, progress, and the spread of civilization. But this story only holds from the colonizer's point of view. The voices of the colonized, those who were enslaved, displaced, or annihilated, are often omitted or marginalized. Their truth is buried beneath a more acceptable version of events that serves national pride or cultural stability. This isn't just about textbooks. It's about language, architecture, celebrations, and law. A city might erect a statue of a military general and call it heritage, while ignoring the communities he helped destroy. A country may celebrate a founding moment that coincided with genocide or slavery. These dominant narratives don't emerge accidentally. They are curated. They reflect not what happened, but what the ruling order wants to be remembered. Foucault also showed how marginalized histories don't vanish. They are suppressed. They live in the silences of the official story, in banned books, erased archives, and communities that carry memory through oral tradition because institutional history won't recognize them. History, then, is a contest of narratives. It's not written by the most truthful. It's written by the most powerful. And once a version of history becomes institutionalized, it becomes very difficult to challenge. Dissenters are dismissed as revisionists, radicals, or conspiracists, even if they are closer to the truth. So the next time you read a historical account, ask, whose story is this? What's left out? Who benefits from this version of the past? Because behind every historical fact, there may lie a deeper struggle, one where truth was not preserved, but silenced. Most people don't think, they just repeat. Friedrich Nietzsche had deep disdain for what he called the herd. He believed that most people are not thinkers, they are echo chambers. They inherit beliefs, moral systems, and political opinions not through reasoned reflection, but through repetition, conformity, and cultural programming. Nietzsche argued that modern morality, especially that rooted in religion and democracy, wasn't the product of deep thought. It was the product of fear. People cling to ready-made values because questioning them would be too uncomfortable, too destabilizing. It's easier to obey than to think. It's easier to recite than to investigate. In this view, education often fails to create thinkers. Instead, it produces repeaters. Schools reward students who memorize, not those who challenge. Institutions favor those who uphold the existing order, not those who question its foundations. The result is a society full of people who sound like they're thinking, but are really just replaying scripts they didn't write. Real thought is disruptive. It threatens the status quo. To truly think means to be willing to offend, to be uncomfortable, to risk isolation. Most people avoid that. They prefer the safety of consensus, even if it's built on lies. Nietzsche believed that true philosophers are rare precisely because thinking is painful. It requires the courage to examine your own beliefs, to admit you were wrong, and to live without the comfort of certainty. It is not a path to popularity. It is a path to inner freedom. So when someone confidently declares a belief, Nietzsche would ask, did you arrive at that through suffering, reflection, and personal struggle? Or are you just repeating what you were told? Most people don't think, they just mimic. And in a world of echo chambers and mass media, that's more true now than ever. Morality is a herd instinct, not a virtue. Friedrich Nietzsche radically redefined the concept of morality. He argued that what we commonly call morality is not a universal truth or an objective standard of virtue. It is a herd instinct. It is a collective behavior evolved for the survival of groups, not the flourishing of individuals. And while it may promote order and reduce harm, Nietzsche saw it as deeply suspicious. A system built not on strength or creativity, but on fear, resentment, and conformity. He distinguished between two fundamental types of morality: master morality and slave morality. Master morality originates from those in positions of strength. For the masters, nobles, warriors, creators, good is defined by what is powerful, life-affirming, and excellent. It's about vitality, honor, and the will to dominate. In this morality, bad is simply the absence of strength, not necessarily evil, just weak or unimpressive. Slave morality, by contrast, is born from the powerless. The oppressed, unable to assert themselves physically or politically, respond by inverting values. What was once called good, strength, ambition, dominance, is rebranded as evil. And the qualities of the weak, meekness, humility, suffering, obedience, are elevated to good. This is not morality based on virtue. It's morality based on resentment, ressentiment. It's the morality of the herd, those who need safety in numbers, who suppress difference, who fear the outsider or the exceptional. Nietzsche believed that Judeo-Christian ethics were the most sophisticated and far-reaching example of this slave morality. By turning suffering into moral superiority and making guilt central to human identity, Christianity, in his view, managed to tame and pacify entire civilizations. It taught people that strength was sinful and that salvation came through weakness, denial, and submission. Modern democratic values, Nietzsche argued, are infected with the same logic. Equality, altruism, and universal rights sound noble, but they can also be tools used by the many to suppress the exceptional individual. A society built on herd morality doesn't want greatness. It wants safety. It wants everyone to be the same because true difference, true power, threatens the collective. To Nietzsche, this moral flattening is a form of cultural decay. It leads to mediocrity, guilt, and stagnation. What is called virtue becomes obedience. What is called compassion becomes control. Herd morality stifles the strong and rewards the compliant. He didn't advocate for cruelty or lawlessness, but for a revaluation of values, where strength, creativity, and life affirmation are once again seen as worthy and noble. The ultimate goal isn't to destroy morality, but to go beyond it, to create new values forged by the individual who has the courage to stand outside the herd. So, when Nietzsche says morality is a herd instinct, he's exposing the hidden architecture of our ethics. He's asking whether we are truly being good or whether we are simply being tamed. The will to live is a cruel, cosmic joke. Arthur Schopenhauer's philosophy is one of the most brutally honest assessments of human existence ever conceived. At its core lies the concept of the will to live, a blind, irrational, and unstoppable force that drives all beings to survive, reproduce, and continue existing regardless of suffering. For Schopenhauer, this will is not a noble force. It is a cosmic joke, a senseless compulsion that gives rise to endless pain and only fleeting moments of pleasure. Unlike many thinkers who begin with reason or consciousness, Schopenhauer starts with will, a primal force that operates beneath all thought and intention. This will is not just human. It animates all of nature. Plants stretch toward the sun. Animals hunt, breed, flee. Humans desire, crave, strive. Everything is an expression of the will to live. But here's the problem. The will never rests. The moment we satisfy a desire, another emerges. Hunger returns. Loneliness returns. Fear returns. Fulfillment is temporary. Suffering is constant. Life becomes a treadmill. We run endlessly, getting nowhere. What drives us is not reason, but an unthinking impulse to continue, no matter the cost. Schopenhauer believed this made life fundamentally tragic. Happiness, he said, is merely the brief absence of pain. Think of any pleasure you've had. It likely followed a craving or discomfort. You don't enjoy food unless you're hungry. You don't enjoy rest unless you're tired. Even joy is fleeting, always chased by boredom or anxiety. The will keeps us restless, and this restlessness is the foundation of existence. The joke, then, is that we are conscious enough to recognize the futility, but not powerful enough to escape it. We can see the absurdity of our condition. We just can't undo it. And the ultimate cruelty? The will to live doesn't care about our suffering. It simply wants to persist. It doesn't care who dies, who starves, or who breaks. It only wants more life. Schopenhauer saw procreation as one of the darkest expressions of this will. We bring new life into the world not out of rational choice, but out of an inherited impulse. And what do we give to the child? More suffering, more struggle, more bondage to the will. To reproduce is to pass on the curse. Is there any escape? Schopenhauer thought there was, but not through indulgence or pleasure. The only escape lies in denial of the will, in asceticism, compassion, and the contemplation of art. In those rare moments when we lose ourselves, when we're absorbed in music, in nature, in beauty, we temporarily step outside the grasp of the will. We become observers, not strivers. But these moments are rare and fragile. The will always returns. That's why Schopenhauer admired the Eastern philosophies of Buddhism and Hinduism, which sought liberation from the cycle of desire. In the West, he found echoes of this in Christian mysticism and philosophical pessimism. To see the will to live as a joke isn't to mock it, it's to confront its terrifying indifference. We are puppets on invisible strings, animated by a force that neither sees nor cares. The tragedy is not that life is hard, it's that it's meaninglessly hard, and we go on anyway. What you call identity is a prison built by language. The modern individual is obsessed with identity. We define ourselves by gender, nationality, race, profession, sexual orientation, mental health labels, and personality types. We wear our identities like armor, insisting they are expressions of our deepest truths. But Michel Foucault and the post-structuralists who followed argued that what we call identity is not innate or liberating. It is a prison constructed and enforced by language and power. Language, in this view, doesn't merely describe reality, it creates it. The moment we name something, we impose limits on it. To say, I am X, is to confine yourself to the cultural, historical, and institutional baggage of that label. These aren't just words, they are categories, each tied to systems of expectation, surveillance, and control. Foucault showed how institutions, medicine, psychiatry, education, religion, use language to produce and regulate identities. Consider the term homosexual. Before the 19th century, same-sex behavior was often considered an action, a sin, a crime, a vice, but not an identity. It wasn't until modern science labeled it as a condition that it became a category of personhood. Suddenly, to engage in same-sex acts was not just to do something, but to be someone. That identity came with consequences: medical diagnosis, moral judgment, legal status, and social stigma. This process happens across the board. Think of how terms like disabled, neurodivergent, or criminal shape how people are treated. These words don't just describe, they confine, they create expectations, policies, and systems of observation. Even positive identities, hero, genius, victim, come with scripts you're expected to perform. The danger is not that identity exists, but that it is seen as fixed, essential, and totalizing. Once you accept an identity, you begin to filter your experience through it. You begin to speak from that position, to defend it, to invest in it. Your world shrinks to what is permissible within that label. And worse, society begins to treat you only through the lens of that identity. Foucault insisted that we should think of the self not as a static entity, but as a product of historical forces. The self is a shifting effect of discourse, something that emerges from the intersections of language, institutions, and power relations. There is no core you hiding underneath the social roles. There is only a dynamic process of becoming, shaped by the structures you move through. This doesn't mean we're doomed to inauthenticity. It means that freedom lies in resistance, in disrupting the language that confines us, in refusing to be pinned down by labels, in creating new forms of subjectivity that escape the logic of categorization. So when Foucault says identity is a prison built by language, he's not saying you're fake. He's saying you've been constructed, often for someone else's convenience. And the key to liberation isn't to find your true self, it's to question the language that told you who you were in the first place. Guilt was invented to enslave the powerful. Friedrich Nietzsche believed that guilt was not an innate emotion nor a universal moral compass. It was a cultural invention, carefully designed to control those with power, vitality, and natural strength. In his view, guilt is a tool forged by the weak to psychologically enslave the strong. It doesn't arise out of true justice or a concern for others. It arises out of ressentiment, the deep resentment of the powerless toward those who possess strength, freedom, and the ability to act without constraint. To understand this, Nietzsche takes us back to what he calls the pre-moral period of human history. In ancient aristocratic societies, strength, pride, and even cruelty were seen as virtues. Morality was a reflection of the ruling class's sense of themselves. To be good meant to be noble, courageous, dominant. The weak were considered bad simply because they lacked those qualities, not because they were morally corrupt. But everything changed with the rise of slave morality, especially as institutionalized through Christianity. Those who had been powerless, the downtrodden, the poor, the meek, developed an entirely new moral system, one that inverted the values of the strong. In this new system, humility became a virtue, suffering became sanctified, and most crucially, power was rebranded as evil. This shift allowed the weak to claim moral superiority over their oppressors, not by overcoming them physically or intellectually, but by making them feel guilty for being strong. Enter the concept of guilt, not as legal responsibility, but as existential shame. The powerful were taught that their instincts, ambition, pride, sexuality, dominance, were sinful. These instincts didn't vanish, of course. Instead, they were turned inward. Nietzsche describes this internalization of instinct as bad conscience, the redirection of natural energy originally used to act and conquer, now used to punish the self. Guilt thus becomes a form of spiritual castration. It turns potential creators into self-flagellating moralists. It breaks the will. The strong man, once a force of life and creativity, becomes a prisoner of his own conscience, afraid to act, ashamed of his desires, eager to confess, repent, and conform. Nietzsche saw this as one of the greatest psychological manipulations in human history. Guilt wasn't a reflection of divine truth. It was a technology of control, perfected by priests, theologians, and moralists who knew they couldn't compete with strength directly. So they waged a war on the inside. They made the lion ashamed of his claws. Modern society continues this legacy. We are encouraged to feel guilty for our success, our privilege, even our desires. Every drive that affirms life is surrounded by warnings. Don't be too confident. Don't take up too much space. Don't assert yourself. The language of guilt remains the weapon of the herd. Nietzsche's answer isn't a rejection of all ethics, but a revaluation of values. We must examine where our morality comes from. Does it lift us higher, or does it chain us to a vision of life that denies vitality and excellence? To escape guilt is not to become a monster. It is to reclaim the right to be powerful without apology. Society punishes not crime, but difference. Michel Foucault radically altered how we think about punishment. In Discipline and Punish, he argued that modern societies don't punish crime in the sense of objective wrongdoing. They punish difference. The deviant, the unclassifiable, the person who threatens the norm, not necessarily through violence or harm, but through nonconformity. Crime becomes a pretext. What's truly being corrected is deviation. Historically, punishment was spectacular and brutal. Public executions were not just about justice, they were performances of sovereign power. But as societies became more complex, punishment moved behind walls and became more subtle. Foucault shows that prisons, schools, hospitals, and military barracks all evolved together into systems of discipline, institutions designed to observe, classify, and normalize individuals. These institutions don't just respond to behavior, they create categories of personhood: the criminal, the patient, the student, the insane. And once you're placed in a category, the system acts on you, not to understand you, but to transform you into something acceptable. Take the prison system. On the surface, it's about detaining those who break laws. But Foucault points out that prisons are full of the poor, the mentally ill, the socially unstable, those who were already marginalized. The justice system claims neutrality, but in practice it polices the boundaries of normality. If you're poor and steal, you go to jail. If you're rich and commit fraud, you negotiate a fine. Schools follow the same logic. Students who can't sit still, don't conform to the pace, or challenge authority are labeled disruptive. They're punished, not necessarily for learning less, but for being different. Even psychiatry, Foucault argued, does this. It draws a line between sane and insane, often based not on objective dysfunction, but on how well someone conforms to social expectations. Society, in this view, does not primarily care about harm. It cares about order. It fears what it cannot predict, what it cannot categorize. And so it develops technologies of punishment not to stop crime, but to enforce a narrow vision of how people should behave, look, speak, and live. Even the architecture reflects this obsession. The panopticon, a circular prison where inmates can be watched at any time without knowing when, becomes a metaphor for modern society. Surveillance replaces force. You begin to police yourself because you might be watched. The goal is not just to punish the different, but to make people fear being different at all. This philosophy has massive implications. It forces us to question the function of our institutions. Are we protecting people or controlling them? Are we correcting behavior or erasing individuality? Foucault's warning is that modern punishment is not about justice. It's about power disguised as care. It's not that society hates crime. It's that society hates unpredictability. And so it trains us from childhood to fear being different. Good and evil are just different perspectives of the same force. Friedrich Nietzsche dismantled the moral categories of good and evil, not by denying that actions have consequences, but by exposing how these categories are subjective, historically contingent, and rooted in power dynamics rather than truth. In his view, good and evil are not opposites. They are interpretations of the same vital force, filtered through different lenses. To understand this, Nietzsche asks us to return to the origin of moral values. In early civilizations, what was good was what the noble class deemed admirable: strength, bravery, vitality, beauty, and power. This was master morality. Good was what affirmed life and dominance. Bad was simply what lacked those qualities: weakness, cowardice, passivity. Not evil, just inferior. But when the oppressed masses couldn't fight back with strength, they created a different morality, slave morality, This inverted the original values. Now, the powerful were cast as evil and the weak were glorified as good. Obedience, humility, self-denial, and suffering became virtues. The will to power didn't vanish. It just changed form. Now it manifested as moral judgment, as the ability to condemn, shame, and guilt the strong. In both systems, the same fundamental drive is at work, the will to power. The noble asserts power directly through action. The weak assert power through moralizing and manipulating language. In both cases, we're dealing with human beings attempting to control and define the world around them. Only the tools differ. This leads Nietzsche to a radical insight. There is no universal good or evil. There are only competing moral frameworks, each trying to impose its interpretation on the world. What one culture or era deems noble, another may condemn. Take sexuality, for instance. What was considered sinful in one century is celebrated in another. The act hasn't changed, but its moral interpretation has. This is not moral relativism in the shallow sense of anything goes. Nietzsche is not saying that cruelty and kindness are the same. He's saying that our labels of good and evil are expressions of perspective, not reflections of eternal truths. And often these labels are used strategically to elevate one's own position and diminish others. Nietzsche's goal is not to destroy values, but to create new ones. He believed that the old moral categories had become stale and suffocating. They no longer served life, they constrained it. The next step for humanity, he believed, was to go beyond good and evil, to embrace a morality that is individual, dynamic, and life-affirming. This requires courage. It means questioning inherited norms, recognizing your own capacity for both creation and destruction, and forging a personal ethic grounded not in guilt or obedience, but in strength, honesty, and vitality. Good and evil, then, are not cosmic truths. They are perspectives, two sides of the same human impulse, the drive to make meaning, impose order, and pursue power. To live wisely is to see through the illusion of fixed morality and choose your values consciously, not inherit them passively. Power creates knowledge, not the other way around. The traditional view of knowledge is that it emerges from observation, inquiry, and rationality. We tend to imagine knowledge as pure and objective, something discovered by free thinkers and scientists, then passed down to the public. But Michel Foucault turned this idea on its head. He argued that power creates knowledge, not the other way around. That is, the kinds of knowledge we produce, accept, and institutionalize are always shaped by who holds power, and how that power wants the world to be understood. To be clear, Foucault wasn't saying that all knowledge is false or conspiratorial. He was saying that what we accept as truth is never neutral. It is always embedded in historical and institutional contexts that serve specific interests. Knowledge, in his view, is not an abstract good. It's a tool of governance, a mechanism of control, and a product of social forces. Consider the field of medicine. Medical knowledge is not just the result of scientific discovery. It's shaped by political, economic, and institutional priorities. Who gets studied? What conditions are prioritized? Which treatments are approved and which are ignored or banned? The answers often reflect power structures, pharmaceutical companies, state regulations, class divisions. Mental illness, for example, has been defined and redefined over centuries, not just by data but by social needs, what society wants to normalize and what it wants to marginalize. Education is another domain where knowledge and power intertwine. School curricula aren't just collections of facts, they're curated narratives. History textbooks may emphasize certain events and omit others. Scientific theories may be taught or withheld depending on political climate. Knowledge becomes a vehicle for national identity, cultural values, and obedience to institutional norms. What you learn is shaped by what those in power want you to believe. Even categories like race, gender, and sexuality are not just biological or psychological facts. They are constructs shaped by the historical interplay of power and knowledge. Foucault showed how 19th century science categorized people in ways that aligned with colonial hierarchies and social control. These truths weren't discovered. They were created and then reinforced through law, education, and medicine. This is what Foucault called a regime of truth, a system in which certain ideas are elevated as valid, rational, or scientific, while others are dismissed as irrational, dangerous, or insane. These regimes are maintained by institutions, universities, courts, hospitals, media. They don't just enforce laws, they shape how people think, what is possible to say, and what is considered normal. So when Foucault says power creates knowledge, he means that truth is not something we uncover like buried treasure. It's something we construct within a framework of social and political forces. Understanding this doesn't mean rejecting knowledge altogether. It means being critically aware of how truth is always tied to authority. The real question isn't just, is this true? But who gets to decide what counts as truth? And why? Your mind is a battlefield of hidden, clashing forces. We like to think of ourselves as unified beings, with stable identities, clear intentions, and coherent thoughts. But much of modern philosophy and psychology suggests otherwise. Nietzsche, Freud, and later thinkers like Foucault and Lacan all challenge the idea of a singular, rational self. They argue instead that the human mind is a battleground, a chaotic arena where multiple, often contradictory forces collide beneath the surface of consciousness. Nietzsche believed that the self is not a stable unity, but a multiplicity of drives. He wrote that behind every "I think" is a complex interaction of instincts, desires, and biological imperatives. What we call rationality is often a surface-level narrative we construct to make sense of deeper, unconscious urges. Our actions are frequently driven not by logic or ethics, but by will to power, ego, resentment, or suppressed fear. Sigmund Freud took this further with his theory of the unconscious. He described the psyche as divided into three parts: the id, our primal drives, the ego, our sense of self, and the superego, internalized moral rules. These forces are in constant tension. The id wants gratification. The superego demands restraint. The ego tries to manage the conflict. Neurosis, Freud argued, arises when these parts clash too intensely, when desires are repressed, redirected, or disguised in dysfunctional ways. Think about moments of indecision, self-sabotage, or contradictory behavior. Why do you procrastinate on things you care about? Why do you lash out at loved ones even when you don't mean to? These are signs that your mind is not a single voice. It's a chorus, and often a dissonant one. Foucault adds another layer to this idea. He emphasized that the forces within us are not just internal, they are shaped by external power structures. Our inner voice is often a product of surveillance, discipline, and social conditioning. The judgments we make about ourselves, our bodies, desires, goals, are shaped by the institutions we've internalized. The self is not just divided, it's colonized. This makes self-understanding incredibly complex. To know oneself is not to find a true self buried underneath layers of falsity. It's to explore the dynamic tension of conflicting drives, traumas, and ideologies battling for control. Your mind is a landscape of competing narratives: childhood fears, cultural values, inherited guilt, unspoken desires. There is no final harmony, only an ongoing negotiation. The most dangerous illusion is the belief that you are coherent, that your actions flow from a singular, rational core. Recognizing the mind as a battlefield doesn't weaken you, it frees you. It allows you to stop pretending you're a finished product and start understanding yourself as a work in progress. One where awareness, reflection, and courage can help you navigate the storm, but never fully silence it. Compassion is often just masked superiority. Compassion is typically celebrated as one of the highest human virtues. It is seen as a marker of morality, empathy, and enlightenment. But certain thinkers, especially Friedrich Nietzsche, view compassion with suspicion. Beneath its gentle face, he saw something more troubling, a disguised form of superiority, a subtle power play wrapped in kindness. To Nietzsche, compassion, Mitleid, is problematic because it can easily become a way for the strong to feel noble and for the weak to remain weak. It is not always motivated by genuine concern. It can also stem from pity, which Nietzsche despised. Pity assumes a position of elevation. When you pity someone, you are implicitly saying, "I am above you, I do not suffer like you, and I will extend my benevolence downward." That is not solidarity. It's condescension. This form of compassion reinforces hierarchy. The sufferer becomes an object, someone defined entirely by their pain, someone who requires saving. The compassionate person becomes the subject, the one with agency, wisdom, and control. This dynamic may look generous, but it preserves inequality rather than dismantles it. Consider how this plays out in charity, activism, or even interpersonal relationships. Sometimes helping others is less about them and more about the ego of the helper. The feel-good rush of being a savior can mask deeper motives, the desire to be admired, the need to feel morally superior, or the urge to control someone else's fate. Compassion becomes a performance, and the other person becomes a stage prop in your moral theater. Nietzsche also criticized the way compassion can perpetuate weakness. When suffering is elevated into moral capital, it discourages strength. If being wounded makes you morally superior, why heal? If being pitied earns you praise, why strive for transformation? Compassion, then, can become a trap for both the giver and the receiver. Even institutions operate this way. Governments and nonprofits often portray certain populations, refugees, addicts, the homeless, as helpless victims. While this can generate support, it also strips these individuals of agency and complexity. Their story is flattened into one of suffering, and the solution becomes saving them, not empowering them. This isn't just patronizing, it's political. It defines who gets to act and who must be acted upon. This is not to say that compassion is always false or harmful, but Nietzsche's critique forces us to examine our motives. Are we helping because we genuinely want to elevate others, or because we want to elevate ourselves? Is our compassion rooted in connection or in control? True compassion, in this view, would not be about superiority. It would be about recognition, seeing the other person as your equal in struggle, in dignity, in potential, not reaching down, but reaching across. And that kind of compassion is rare because it requires humility. It requires you to give without feeling superior, to help without making someone into a project, to care not as a way of feeling good, but as a way of affirming shared humanity. Every truth was once a dangerous heresy. We tend to treat truth as if it's timeless, as if what we accept as obvious today has always been obvious. But history tells a different story. Every widely accepted truth, whether scientific, moral, or political, was once a dangerous heresy, punished by institutions, condemned by society, and often silenced with violence. This philosophy exposes the political and historical nature of truth, forcing us to ask, who decides what counts as truth, and what had to die for it to be accepted? Galileo's telescope didn't just point to the heavens, it pointed straight into the heart of a power struggle. When he supported the heliocentric model that the Earth revolved around the Sun, he wasn't just proposing a new scientific idea. He was challenging the worldview of the Church, which had enshrined geocentrism as divine order. His truth threatened not only theology, but the authority of the institution built upon it. He was forced to recant under threat of death. Today, his ideas are considered basic science, but once they were heresy. This dynamic plays out across time and culture. Thinkers like Socrates burned at the stake not for what they did, but for what they questioned. Darwin, who destabilized the biblical creation narrative. Women suffragists, once mocked and jailed, now remembered as icons. Abolitionists, civil rights activists, whistleblowers, they all begin as dangerous heretics because their truths threatened entrenched systems of belief and control. Michel Foucault and other postmodern thinkers argued that truth is not a pure discovery, it's a construct. What gets called truth is often what has been filtered through dominant ideologies, cultural norms, and institutional power. Truth is policed. New ideas are resisted not necessarily because they're false, but because they disrupt. The very process of declaring something heresy is an act of self-preservation by those in power. Heresy is not simply a wrong idea, it's a threat. It's a deviation from the accepted order, a spark that could ignite chaos. By labeling something as heretical, institutions invalidate it in the public mind before it can be examined seriously. And yet, if history teaches us anything, it's that many of these heresies eventually become truth, not because they suddenly became true, but because enough people were willing to risk everything to speak them, and because those in power eventually lost the ability to suppress them. So, when we accept truths today about science, morality, politics, it's worth remembering that these truths were born in fire. And it's worth asking, what do we call heresy now that might one day be considered self-evident? Who is being silenced now for saying something we're not ready to hear? Every truth has a birth story, and it usually starts in rebellion. Education is domestication. We often romanticize education as the pure pursuit of knowledge. It's sold to us as liberation, a pathway to enlightenment and empowerment. But there is a darker, more critical view, one that sees education as domestication, a process not of freeing minds, but of training them to conform to existing systems of power, order, and obedience. Michel Foucault, Ivan Illich, and other radical theorists challenged the assumption that education is neutral. They pointed out that schools are not just places where facts are transmitted. They are institutions that discipline the body and shape the mind. The bells, the rows of desks, the standardized testing, the constant evaluation, all these rituals aren't just practical tools. They are methods of conditioning. In this sense, schools resemble prisons or factories. Students are taught to show up on time, obey authority, perform tasks, and accept being ranked and compared. Creativity is tolerated only when it fits within predefined boundaries. Questions are welcomed, so long as they don't challenge the underlying assumptions of the system. Individualism is encouraged rhetorically, but punished when it disrupts the standardized curriculum. Illich argued that schools don't exist to cultivate free-thinking individuals. They exist to reproduce the social order. The child is not taught to think critically about society, but to function within it. Education becomes a tool for producing good citizens, productive workers, and responsible adults, terms that often mean obedient, predictable, and compliant. Subjects like history are shaped by nationalism. Economics is taught through the lens of capitalism. Even science is sometimes stripped of its philosophical and ethical dimensions, becoming a set of memorized formulas rather than a tool for questioning reality. The deeper you look, the more it seems that the structure of education is less about awakening the mind and more about shaping it to fit a mold. Even higher education, once seen as a sanctuary of free inquiry, has become increasingly vocational, commodified, and bureaucratic. Students go into debt not to explore ideas, but to purchase credentials. Universities compete in rankings and branding, churning out degrees that serve corporate needs more than intellectual freedom. This doesn't mean that knowledge has no place in education, but it means that knowledge is delivered through a gatekeeping system. The curriculum is decided by authorities. The assessments reward conformity. The ultimate goal is not just learning, it's domestication, taming wild, curious minds and making them serviceable to institutions. And the most effective domestication is the one that disguises itself as freedom. The world is not logical, it's absurd and hostile. Philosophers like Albert Camus, Soren Kierkegaard, and even Friedrich Nietzsche have argued that the world is not governed by reason or morality. It is fundamentally absurd, even hostile to human attempts at understanding. The more we try to impose order, meaning, or justice on the world, the more we're met with indifference. In this view, existence is not a coherent puzzle to be solved. It is a cosmic joke, and we are its unwilling audience. Albert Camus' concept of the absurd captures this perfectly. He describes the absurd as the conflict between the human desire for meaning and the silent, indifferent universe. We want life to make sense. We crave patterns, fairness, purpose. But the universe offers none. People suffer without reason. Good people die early. Bad people thrive. Natural disasters wipe out lives indiscriminately. The world operates according to no moral logic. Kierkegaard, from a theological perspective, also recognized this absurdity. He pointed out that faith itself requires a leap into the irrational, because reason cannot reconcile the contradictions of existence. To believe in something ultimate, God, meaning salvation, is not logical. It is absurd. But that leap, for him, is what makes life bearable. Friedrich Nietzsche took a different approach. He saw the absurd not just in the silence of the universe, but in the collapse of inherited meaning systems. Once God is dead, Nietzsche warned, we're left without an anchor. The old truths are gone, but we still live as if they're true. We pretend life has meaning, even when we know it doesn't. This contradiction breeds nihilism. The hostility of the world is not just natural, it's social too. We build systems, governments, economies, religions, thinking they'll bring justice and peace. But these systems often reflect the worst of us: greed, violence, prejudice, power lust. Try to live ethically, and you may be crushed by bureaucracy. Seek truth, and you'll be ridiculed or ignored. This is not a world shaped for virtue. It's a world that punishes those who seek it too purely. Camus famously used the myth of Sisyphus to illustrate how we respond to absurdity. Sisyphus is condemned to roll a boulder uphill for eternity, only for it to roll back down each time. It's meaningless, futile. But Camus tells us we must imagine Sisyphus happy. Why? Because in the face of absurdity, we still have freedom. We still have the ability to choose how we live, even if we can't choose the universe we live in. So the world isn't logical. It doesn't owe you fairness. It won't validate your efforts or reward your virtue. But in that chaos lies a strange kind of freedom. If nothing matters objectively, then everything you create, your art, your love, your courage, is your defiant act, your personal rebellion against the absurd. Reason is a mask humans wear to justify irrational desires. Humans like to think of themselves as rational beings, guided by logic, evidence, and deliberate thought. But beneath the surface of our decisions lies a tangled web of impulses, fears, traumas, instincts, and unconscious drives. The idea that reason is a mask suggests that rationality is often not the cause of our choices, but the story we tell ourselves after the fact. We act first, emotionally, instinctively, and then build a neat, rational narrative to explain what we've already decided to do. This was a central insight in the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche and the psychoanalytic theories of Sigmund Freud. Nietzsche argued that behind every moral argument or philosophical system is a will to power, a personal drive, a desire to dominate, control, or affirm life. What we call truth or logic is often just a convenient tool to justify what our instincts have already committed to. We want something, status, revenge, intimacy, escape, and reason supplies a post facto justification. Freud echoed this with his theory of the unconscious. He believed that the ego constructs rational explanations to protect the conscious mind from uncomfortable truths. A man might say he changed careers for noble reasons, but deep down he may have felt insecure, rejected, or envious. The rational story allows him to maintain a sense of self-control and moral clarity, even if the real motivators were irrational. Think about how often people fall in love, pick political sides, start arguments, or make major life decisions based on gut feelings. Later, they compile a list of logical reasons to defend those choices. But the real driver was emotional. Behavioral economics and neuroscience have only strengthened this idea. Studies consistently show that people make snap judgments emotionally, and then use logic to reinforce those judgments. This philosophy also challenges the idealization of reason in Enlightenment thinking. The Enlightenment taught us that human progress would come through rationality, science, reason, debate. But if reason is often just a mask, then progress is not purely rational either. It's a battlefield of competing interests, values, and unconscious motivations dressed up in intellectual clothing. Even institutions that pride themselves on reason, academia, law, politics, are full of emotional and social dynamics. Prestige, fear of rejection, tribal loyalty, ambition, all these irrational forces shape what ideas get promoted or dismissed. Reason is often the costume worn by deeper, messier forces that we'd rather not confront. This doesn't mean reason is worthless. It's a powerful tool for reflection, analysis, and communication. But this philosophy reminds us that reason is not pure. It's not the driver. It's the mask. And until we learn to see through that mask, we may never truly understand why we do what we do. Self-sacrifice is often just veiled egoism. Self-sacrifice is often viewed as the pinnacle of moral virtue. We admire those who give up their time, comfort, or even lives for others. But philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche suggest that self-sacrifice may not be as selfless as it seems. In fact, it can be a sophisticated form of egoism, a way to gain moral superiority, social approval, or psychological relief under the guise of nobility. At the heart of this idea is the distinction between intention and outcome. People may appear to act selflessly, but what motivates them can be deeply self-serving. Consider the person who gives endlessly to others, to the point of exhaustion. Are they truly selfless, or do they derive identity, pride, and emotional reward from being the giver? In many cases, the self-sacrificer creates a role for themselves that feeds their ego. The martyr, the savior, the one who is always needed. Nietzsche saw Christianity as the institutionalization of this egoism disguised as virtue. He critiqued the exaltation of suffering and self-denial as tools to gain moral leverage. By choosing to suffer, the individual gains power, not physical or political power, but moral power. They can shame the strong, demand sympathy, and claim spiritual superiority. Look at how much I've given. becomes a subtle form of, "Look at how good I am." This dynamic plays out in relationships too. A parent might say, "I gave up everything for you," not purely out of love, but as a way to claim control or moral debt. In this case, the sacrifice isn't free, it's an investment, and the expected return is loyalty, recognition, or guilt. Even in activism or charity work, self-sacrifice can become a way of crafting a heroic self-image. The ego is not renounced, it is simply redirected. Helping others can become a way of feeling important, indispensable, morally elevated. The good deed becomes a currency for self-worth. This doesn't mean all acts of sacrifice are fake or manipulative, but it does mean we need to look deeper. Is the act truly about the other person, or is it about how it makes the giver feel? Are they sacrificing to empower others, or to cement their own status as the good one? True selflessness, if it exists, might be so rare because it offers no payoff, no recognition, no control, no moral capital. It would be an act done anonymously, without expectation. But most human behavior, even the noblest, carries traces of self-interest. And often, the more loudly someone proclaims their sacrifices, the more ego is lurking behind the curtain. Nietzsche Schui's message isn't to abandon kindness or generosity, but to be honest about why we act. Because if we don't acknowledge the ego in our sacrifices, we risk turning virtue into a mask for control. The highest joy is overcoming yourself, not others. In a world obsessed with competition, conquest, and domination, the idea that the greatest victory is over yourself sounds almost revolutionary. But for philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche, this was the truest path to human greatness. The most profound joy, he believed, doesn't come from beating others, but from surpassing your former self, from breaking free of your old limitations, fears, patterns, and illusions. Nietzsche called this process self-overcoming, Selbstüberwindung. It's not about ascetic self-denial, nor is it about perfection. It's about transformation. Life, he argued, is not a fixed identity, but a constant becoming. And the greatest joy lies in becoming someone you were not before. Someone stronger, freer, more authentic. This journey begins with self-awareness. You can't overcome yourself if you don't know what's limiting you. Are your beliefs really yours, or were they inherited, unexamined? Are your habits the result of conscious choice, or are they defenses built from fear? Nietzsche invites us to confront our internal machinery, our cowardice disguised as humility, our need for approval masked as morality, our laziness masked as contentment. Unlike traditional morality, which often emphasizes self-control or self-punishment, Nietzsche's philosophy celebrates expansion. Overcoming yourself doesn't mean suppressing your desires, it means refining them, channeling them into creative power, into new values, into something life-affirming. It's a heroic act, not a puritanical one. This idea also stands in sharp contrast to external conquest. Defeating others can feed the ego, but it rarely brings lasting joy. Because no matter how many people you surpass, your inner battles remain. You can win the world and still be ruled by insecurity, shame, or fear. True victory isn't when others bow to you. It's when your past self would look at you in awe. Nietzsche's Übermensch embodies this idea. The overman isn't someone who dominates people. It's someone who creates new meaning in a meaningless world. He doesn't follow rules. He writes them, not for power, but for self-expression, not for domination, but for liberation. And yet, this path isn't easy. Self-overcoming involves risk, discomfort, even suffering. You must confront your own illusions. You must sacrifice certainty for growth. But in doing so, you gain something that no external victory can offer: authentic joy, a joy that is earned, not inherited, discovered, not given. In a society that rewards external success and punishes introspection, choosing to overcome yourself may seem like the harder path. But it is the only one that leads to real transformation. Because the most formidable opponent you will ever face isn't out there, it's you. And when you learn to rise above who you were, the joy is not just in the winning, but in the becoming. Civilization is built on repression and denial. Civilization appears, on the surface, to be a triumph of order, culture, and rationality. We build cities, write laws, develop moral codes, and create institutions to protect, educate, and elevate human life. But thinkers like Sigmund Freud and Friedrich Nietzsche would argue that this very order is sustained by repression, by denying our most basic instincts, desires, and drives. The cost of civilization is not only effort and sacrifice, it is a deep psychological suppression of what it means to be fully human. Freud's Civilization and its Discontents lays this out clearly. He believed that human beings are driven by two fundamental instincts: eros, the life drive, sex, connection, creativity, and thanatos, the death drive, aggression, domination, destruction. These drives are not polite, rational, or moral. They are primal. To create a stable society, these impulses have to be controlled, and the method of control is repression. From childhood, we are taught what is acceptable. We are punished for tantrums, scolded for aggression, told to behave, to share, to sit still, to wait our turn. The wild energy of the child is slowly domesticated. We learn to internalize social rules, not because we fully understand them, but because we fear disapproval, shame, or punishment. The result is the creation of the superego, the internal voice that polices the ego, enforcing societal norms even when no one is watching. But this comes at a cost. The drives don't vanish. They go underground, into the unconscious. The repressed libido becomes anxiety. The suppressed rage becomes passive aggression or self-harm. Civilization thrives on these sublimated energies. Artists, entrepreneurs, priests, and warriors all redirect repressed instincts into socially acceptable channels. But repression doesn't resolve the conflict. It just hides it under the mask of civility. Nietzsche made a similar critique. He believed that society, particularly under the influence of religion, had taught people to turn their instincts inward. What once was celebrated, strength, pride, sexual vitality, became sins. The strong man became guilty. The passionate woman became ashamed. Civilization, in this view, is a kind of self-mutilation, where we deny who we are in order to belong. This process creates what Freud called a perpetual discontent. We crave freedom, pleasure, and expression, but live in a world that demands discipline, restraint, and conformity. Our neuroses are not personal failures. They are the byproducts of civilization itself. In the end, civilization depends on a grand bargain. We exchange instinct for safety, chaos for order, raw vitality for refinement. But that bargain is not without pain. The repression that fuels civilization also haunts it. Behind every polished city and moral doctrine lies a buried truth, that the human soul has been trimmed, caged, and denied. And it remembers. Most people are too afraid to see. Seeing in the philosophical sense is not about vision. It's about awareness, clarity when truth without illusion. It means seeing yourself, the world, and others without filters, without the comforting lies, the social masks, the ideological fog. And this, perhaps more than anything, terrifies people. Because once you truly see, you can't unsee. And seeing often demands change. This idea flows through the work of thinkers like Soren Kierkegaard, Friedrich Nietzsche, and even modern psychologists like Carl Jung. Most people live within a carefully constructed version of reality. It may be false, limited, or one-sided, but it's safe. It keeps their beliefs intact. It keeps their roles stable. It allows them to function without confronting the chaos beneath the surface. Kierkegaard wrote about despair as the state of being unconscious of oneself. People despair not because they are overwhelmed by suffering, but because they are afraid of becoming fully awake. They fear the truth of their own freedom, their potential, their contradictions. They would rather cling to comforting fictions than step into the terrifying vastness of authentic existence. Nietzsche called this the will to ignorance. Most people don't want to know the truth. They want a truth that suits them. They avoid difficult questions. They cling to traditions. They demonize those who challenge consensus. This is not because they're stupid. It's because seeing demands responsibility. Once you see injustice, you are morally obligated to respond. Once you see your own hypocrisy, you must confront it. Once you see that your life is built on fear or avoidance, you can no longer live passively. Seeing is a threat to comfort. Carl Jung would describe this resistance as a fear of the shadow, the unconscious part of ourselves we refuse to face. To truly see means to confront the parts of ourselves we've denied, the envy, the rage, the insecurity, the unfulfilled longing. It means admitting that the image we present to the world is incomplete and sometimes a lie. But people are terrified of the shadow, so they project it onto others. They externalize the evil they cannot face within. Even on a societal level, most systems are built to prevent true seeing. Media, religion, politics, education, they all offer curated narratives, comforting distractions, and a sense of control. Critical thinkers, whistleblowers, artists, and philosophers are often seen as dangerous because they threaten the illusion. They force people to see what they'd rather avoid. But seeing is not just painful, it's liberating. It's the first step toward transformation. Only when you see can you choose freely. Only when you face the truth can you begin to live it. But that requires courage. And most people, tragically, would rather be comfortable than free. Religions survive by feeding on fear. Religions have shaped civilizations, inspired revolutions, and offered solace in the face of death. But at their core, many religions operate not on love or truth, but on fear. Fear of punishment, fear of sin, fear of the unknown, fear of death. This fear is not a byproduct of religion. It is its fuel. It's what keeps people compliant, loyal, and obedient. Without fear, many religions would lose their grip. Friedrich Nietzsche saw this dynamic clearly. He argued that religious institutions took natural human instincts, like sexuality, pride, ambition, and labeled them as sinful. Why? Because in making people feel guilty for being human, religion gains moral authority. It positions itself as the only path to salvation. You're sick, it says, and we have the cure, but first, you must submit. This fear is often deeply psychological. From a young age, people are told they are inherently flawed, that a cosmic being watches their every move, that even thoughts can be sinful. This internalized surveillance creates a kind of self-policing. You don't need external punishment if the believer constantly fears their own unworthiness. Religions also promise protection from suffering, from meaninglessness, from death. But the promise only works if the threat is believed. The fear of hell, of divine wrath, of eternal separation, these are powerful motivators. They are more emotionally potent than abstract concepts like love or grace. Fear keeps people in line. It builds empires, fills temples, and silences dissent. Even organized rituals and symbols reinforce fear. Confession, penance, fasting, sacrifice, all these practices remind the believer of their inadequacy and their dependence on the divine. Religious leaders act as intermediaries, often claiming exclusive access to truth or salvation. This centralizes power and prevents individual questioning, because to question is to risk damnation. Fear also explains why religions often resist change. New ideas are seen as threats not just to doctrine, but to the emotional order. Doubt is not treated as curiosity, it's treated as rebellion. Because if people stop being afraid, they might stop needing religion. This is not to say that all religious people live in terror, or that all spiritual systems are manipulative, but the historical success of religion has often depended on its ability to monopolize fear, to define what people should fear, and then offer itself as the solution. It creates a problem, and then sells the cure. Fear gives religion emotional leverage. It turns faith into obligation, and it allows institutions to survive for centuries, not by uplifting humanity, but by controlling it through anxiety. Once you see this, it becomes clear why so many religions need fear to flourish, because without it, people might realize that they were never condemned to begin with. They were just afraid. Your soul? Just a historical invention. The concept of the soul, the eternal, immaterial core of our being, feels so deeply embedded in human culture that it's easy to mistake it for something innate or universal. But thinkers like Michel Foucault and Friedrich Nietzsche would challenge that assumption. From their perspective, the soul is not an unchanging essence, but a historical construct invented and shaped by power structures, religious institutions, and shifting cultural narratives. In earlier societies, people didn't necessarily believe in a personal, eternal soul, as we do today. Many ancient cultures focused on ritual, lineage, or the body, not an internal, moral essence. The Judeo-Christian tradition played a major role in giving the soul its current form, eternal, divine, and tied to moral judgment. Over centuries, the soul evolved into a tool of surveillance, a way to internalize authority, to make people self-regulating. Michel Foucault examined this in Discipline and Punish, arguing that modern power doesn't just operate by punishing bodies, it shapes souls. Prisons, schools, and hospitals don't merely control behavior, they define what a person is. They categorize, diagnose, moralize. The result is a soul that is continuously inspected, corrected, normalized. As Foucault put it, the soul is the prison of the body, a powerful reversal of the ancient belief that the body imprisons the soul. This concept becomes even more apparent when you consider how the idea of the soul changes across time and geography. In medieval Europe, the soul was the site of salvation or damnation, controlled by the Church. In the Enlightenment, it became associated with reason and individuality. In the 19th century, psychology began redefining the soul as the psyche, something measurable, analyzable, and eventually treatable. In each case, the soul adapts to reflect the values and technologies of the time. Even today, we talk about people having good souls or soulmates, often without questioning what we mean. But are we referring to an actual metaphysical entity? Or are we clinging to a narrative that gives coherence to our moral and emotional lives? Nietzsche saw belief in the soul as a symptom of humanity's refusal to accept mortality and meaninglessness. The soul, in his view, was a comforting illusion, a way to escape the terror of a finite, purposeless existence. If the soul is eternal, then life has value, then suffering has meaning, then justice will be served, if not in this life, then in the next. But what if there is no soul, just a body, a brain, a narrative we keep telling ourselves? What if everything we attribute to the soul, conscience, love, ambition, guilt, is just a complex interaction of biology, memory, language, and social conditioning? This doesn't mean we are empty or meaningless. It means that the soul is not a discovery, but an invention, one that served powerful functions in religion, morality, and governance. To question it is not to destroy meaning, but to understand how it was made and how we might remake it for ourselves. Our desire for truth is often a disguised need for control. Truth is one of the most sacred ideals in Western thought. From ancient philosophers to modern scientists, the pursuit of truth is treated as noble, objective, and pure. But Michel Foucault and Friedrich Nietzsche ask a dangerous question. What if our desire for truth is not about discovery, but about domination? What if truth isn't something we humbly seek, but something we create to serve power? Nietzsche argued that truth is not a reflection of reality. It is a function of language, metaphor, and utility. In his essay on Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense, he described truth as a mobile army of metaphors. That is, we take fluid, complex realities and lock them into rigid words and categories. Over time, we forget these categories are inventions. We begin to treat them as objective, even sacred. This truth gives us comfort and control. It allows us to navigate life, but it also blinds us to everything outside the system we've built. Foucault took this further by arguing that truth is produced within regimes of power. In other words, the truths we accept are deeply embedded in historical, social, and political systems. Institutions like science, medicine, education, and law don't just discover truth. They define what can be true, who gets to speak it, and what counts as evidence. These systems create truth in ways that reinforce their own authority. Think about how medical science once labeled homosexuality a mental disorder, or how early anthropology justified colonialism through so-called racial truths. These were not errors in data, they were structures of control disguised as neutral knowledge. The desire to know others often masked a desire to classify, dominate, and manage them. Even in daily life, we use truth as a way to assert power. We say things like, "I'm just being honest," when we really mean, "I want to control the narrative." We use facts selectively, not to understand, but to win arguments. We frame opinions as truths and demand others conform. At its core, the desire for truth often masks a fear of ambiguity and chaos. The world is complex, unstable, and unpredictable. To cope, we construct truths about gender, morality, politics, identity that give us a sense of mastery. But that mastery is often illusion. And maintaining it requires constant policing of dissent, of deviance, of difference. Foucault's challenge is not to abandon truth, but to question who defines it and why. He urges us to look at the machinery behind truth, the labs, the courts, the schools, the experts. What do they exclude? What do they silence? And what alternatives might emerge if we stopped treating truth as absolute and started treating it as constructed, contingent, and contested? Because sometimes the truth we seek is less about enlightenment and more about control disguised as clarity. Suicide can be a rational escape from the will to live. Arthur Schopenhauer, one of the most uncompromising philosophers of pessimism, believed that life is driven by a blind, insatiable force he called the will to live. This will is not rational or moral. It's a relentless drive to exist, to consume, to reproduce. It animates all of nature, from the crawling insect to the anxious human. But in Schopenhauer's view, this will is also the root of all suffering. Because the will never rests, we are never truly satisfied. Every fulfilled desire gives way to a new one. Hunger is followed by boredom. Success is chased by emptiness. And so existence becomes a cycle of striving and disappointment. Pleasure is fleeting. Pain is constant. Schopenhauer saw this not as an occasional problem, but as the fundamental structure of reality. In this context, suicide is not simply an act of despair. It is, in some cases, a rational response to an irrational system. If life is dominated by a force that compels us to suffer for no higher reason, then choosing to step outside that cycle becomes a deeply philosophical act. To reject the will is to reclaim one's autonomy in the face of a cosmic joke. But Schopenhauer is careful. He does not glorify suicide. He distinguishes between escapism and transcendence. Suicide, he says, may be a rejection of suffering, but it is also a submission to the will. It is the will turning against itself. The person who kills themselves is still acting from the same compulsion, only in reverse. It's a rebellion from within the system, not an exit from it. However, this doesn't mean it's irrational. In a world where suffering is inescapable and meaning is not guaranteed, the choice to end one's life can be seen as a lucid judgment, especially when weighed against a future filled only with continued torment. Albert Camus addressed this directly in The Myth of Sisyphus. He called suicide the only serious philosophical question. If life is absurd, if it has no meaning beyond what we project, then why live? Camus ultimately argued against suicide, not because it's irrational, but because it bypasses the chance to rebel. He believed we must confront the absurd and live in defiance of it. Still, acknowledging suicide as rational is different from endorsing it. It means recognizing that for some, continued existence may feel more unbearable than non-existence, and that this calculation is not always the result of madness or weakness. It can be the product of clarity. This philosophy forces us to confront not just death, but life itself. Why continue? What are we living for? Is enduring always noble, or is there dignity in saying, I have seen enough and I choose no more? In a world ruled by the will to live, choosing to die may be the final act of freedom, and whether we agree with it or not, that freedom deserves to be understood, not judged. Normal is just what power defines as safe. Normal is one of the most casually used words in any language. We use it to describe behavior, people, ideas, and appearances. But the deeper you examine it, the more you realize that normal is not a neutral term, it's a political one. Michel Foucault, among others, showed that what we call normal is not a natural state, but a social construction shaped by institutions of power to define what is acceptable, manageable, and controllable. To understand this, consider how societies have always drawn lines between normal and abnormal. But those lines shift depending on who's in charge, what they fear, and what they want to promote. In the 19th century, being left-handed was abnormal. Homosexuality was a diagnosable mental illness. Women who expressed anger were considered hysterical. These weren't just cultural quirks, they were enforcements of power-defined norms. Foucault emphasized that institutions like psychiatry, medicine, education, and the criminal justice system are not just about care, knowledge, or safety. They are about disciplining bodies and minds. They decide what behaviors are acceptable, what beliefs are rational, and who gets to participate fully in society. Normal is the label they stamp on those who conform. Abnormal is reserved for those who deviate, and deviation must be corrected, punished, or excluded. Take schools. The student who sits still, follows directions, and excels on standardized tests is considered normal. The student who questions authority, learns differently, or challenges the system is labeled as disruptive or in need of remediation. The truth is, the first student is easier to manage. Normal here just means non-threatening to the structure. This logic plays out across race, gender, sexuality, religion, and class. What's considered normal in one society, monogamy, thinness, upward career mobility, becomes a moral baseline. Those who fall outside are not just seen as different, they're often treated as dangerous. The more someone disrupts the dominant social order, the more likely they are to be labeled abnormal. And who defines this normal? Not the people en masse, but those who hold institutional power: governments, religious authorities, media conglomerates, educational systems. They shape norms to serve stability, not truth; predictability, not freedom. Understanding this changes how we see deviance. Often, it's the so-called abnormal people, artists, dissidents, nonconformists, who see reality more clearly, who refuse to participate in lies dressed as customs. Yet they are silenced, not because they're wrong, but because they make the system feel unsafe. So when we say something is not normal, we should ask, normal for whom? Who benefits from that definition? What kind of world is being protected? And who is being excluded from it? Because normal is rarely about truth. It's about safety for the powerful and the containment of everyone else. The Übermensch creates values, not obeys them. Friedrich Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch, often translated as Overman or Superman, is not about physical strength, domination, or arrogance. It's about the ultimate individual, one who transcends the inherited values of society and creates their own values, instead of obeying those imposed by religion, tradition, or mass culture. Nietzsche saw that most people live according to values they did not choose. They inherit moral systems from religion, conform to social norms, and accept truths handed to them by authority figures. These values often discourage strength, risk, desire, and pride. They elevate meekness, obedience, and suffering, what Nietzsche called slave morality. In contrast, the Übermensch is someone who rises above this herd mentality. This figure doesn't rebel for rebellion's sake. They understand that values are not fixed truths, but human creations, tools for living, not divine commandments. Once this is realized, the next step is not nihilism, but value creation. The Übermensch is not bound by guilt or fear. They ask, what do I want to affirm? What kind of life do I want to live? And then they invent a code that reflects that vision, even if it contradicts everything they've been taught. This is a radical freedom, but also a tremendous burden. It means you cannot blame others, hide behind dogma, or follow tradition blindly. To become the Übermensch, you must take full responsibility for your choices and the values you live by. You must craft meaning in a world that offers none. Nietzsche introduced this concept in the aftermath of his declaration that God is dead. He didn't mean that a deity had literally perished, but that belief in a metaphysical foundation for morality was eroding. Without God, there was no longer an absolute standard of good and evil. This left a vacuum, one that could lead to despair or to creative transformation. The Übermensch is Nietzsche's answer to that vacuum. This individual doesn't retreat into cynicism or hedonism. Instead, they embrace life with joyful strength, what he called amor fati, the love of fate. They don't seek approval, redemption, or reward. They act out of an internal commitment to becoming who they are, fully and without apology. This figure is rare, not because the path is closed, but because most people lack the courage to take it. It requires honesty, discipline, imagination, and resilience. The Übermensch is not born. They are forged through struggle, isolation, and self-overcoming. So the Übermensch is not a superhero. They are not better than others in a moral sense. They are simply free, not from consequences, but from inherited illusions. They don't follow values. They create them, and in doing so, become a work of art. Love is often a sophisticated form of domination. Love is usually romanticized as pure, selfless, and noble. It's portrayed as the great equalizer, uniting souls, transcending boundaries, softening hearts. But beneath the poetry and sentiment, love can often function as a sophisticated form of domination, an emotional dynamic where one person seeks to possess, control, or define the other, often in the name of affection. Nietzsche hinted at this when he described love as the most angelic instinct turned into the most cunning cruelty. What makes love dangerous is not that it is false, but that it is intensely personal and deeply manipulative. Unlike overt power structures like politics or war, love works from the inside. It cloaks itself in intimacy, but it can involve subtle coercion, emotional dependence, and ownership disguised as devotion. Many relationships are built on the idea that to love someone is to possess them, emotionally, sexually, even existentially. We say things like, "You complete me," or "You're mine." These phrases seem romantic, but they reveal a desire to make the other person part of your identity. This reduces them from an autonomous being to a function of your emotional landscape. You don't love them as they are. You love what they give you: comfort, stability, validation, or meaning. This is especially evident in relationships where jealousy, control, or obligation are present. One partner may expect the other to give up friendships, hobbies, or ambitions in the name of love, or they may manipulate with guilt. "If you loved me, you'd do this." In such cases, love becomes a negotiation of power, and the stronger personality often dominates, even without malice. Feminist and psychoanalytic theorists have long noted how traditional gender roles shape love into a tool of social control. In patriarchal societies, for instance, love has often been used to encourage women's submission. Emotional labor, self-sacrifice, and the prioritization of the partner's needs are idealized, making domination seem like devotion. Conversely, men may experience love as pressure to possess and protect, equating control with care. Even the desire to be loved can be a form of domination over oneself. People mold their behavior, appearance, and speech in order to be desirable. They suppress parts of themselves that don't fit the idealized image. They discipline themselves into being lovable, giving others the power to define their worth. This doesn't mean love is inherently corrupt, but it suggests we need to be vigilant about its hidden structures. Real love should be rooted in recognition, not possession, in freedom, not control. It should affirm the other person's autonomy, not absorb it. To truly love someone means to allow them to exist outside your desires, and that's far harder and rarer than most people think, because it requires relinquishing the very instinct that makes love feel powerful, the urge to say, "You are mine." Death doesn't liberate, it just silences. Death is often romanticized as a release, a final escape from pain, obligation, identity, or even the burden of existence. Many religious and philosophical traditions treat death as a liberation from the body, from sin, from the wheel of suffering, or from the absurdity of life. But this view can be misleading, because in reality, death doesn't liberate, it just silences. To be liberated implies agency, freedom, transformation, transcendence. But death is the end of agency, the annihilation of voice, intention, and experience. Whatever power you had to shape the world, speak your truth, or defy injustice disappears. You are no longer there to liberate or be liberated. You are simply absent. Michel Foucault and other post-structuralists often challenge the way societies narrate death. He observed that cultures tend to manage death by turning it into a ritual, a symbol, or a myth. Death becomes a story told by the living, one that reflects their fears, ideologies, and moral codes. But these stories can erase the actual person who died. The dead do not get to write their legacy. Others do. This silencing is especially cruel when it comes to political deaths, those who die fighting oppression, whistleblowers, exiles, rebels. Once they are gone, their ideas can be diluted, appropriated, or simply erased. History is full of revolutionary voices that were muted by death, only to be rewritten by the very systems they opposed. Even in personal life, death often silences unresolved truths. The unsaid remains unsaid, the apology never delivered, the trauma never confronted. We imagine closure, but more often there is absence without resolution. And those left behind are tasked with inventing meaning or peace in a space that offers neither. Friedrich Nietzsche's reflections on death challenge the idea that it completes a person. He believed that life itself must be justified, not by what comes after, but by what we do while we're here. Death doesn't crown life with meaning, it interrupts it. And unless one has lived fully, without illusion, with strength and affirmation, death simply halts the process. There is no final reckoning, no cosmic scorecard, just silence. This view can be unsettling, but it also demands a more honest engagement with mortality. It calls us to speak now, act now, love now. Because after death, there is no more speech, no more defiance, no more correction. The idea that death liberates can make us complacent, but knowing that it merely silences forces us to ask what must be said before the silence comes. Sex is a political act. Sex is often framed as a private, intimate, even sacred act. It's seen as a matter of personal desire, affection, or biology. But philosophers like Michel Foucault and feminist theorists have shown that sex is never just sex. It is always embedded in power structures, shaped by culture, law, religion, economy, and therefore it is a political act. Foucault, in The History of Sexuality, argued that modern societies don't repress sex, they obsess over it. Institutions classify, regulate, and normalize sexual behavior. Medical systems define what's healthy. Legal systems define what's permissible. Religious authorities define what's pure. The result is a network of rules that determine not only what we do in bed, but who we are allowed to be in the world. The language of identity itself, gay, straight, cisgender, asexual, is deeply political. These aren't just descriptions of desire. They are categories that carry rights, expectations, stigmas, and historical baggage. To be outed, to marry, to adopt, to receive health care, these things depend on how one's sexuality fits into legally and socially sanctioned frameworks. So when someone expresses or withholds their sexuality, they are not just acting personally, they are engaging a political system. Feminist theorists like Catherine McKinnon and Audre Lorde argued that sex cannot be separated from systems of gendered power. In patriarchal cultures, male desire is often normalized, while female pleasure is marginalized, monitored, or shamed. The sexual double standard is not just a moral issue, it's a tool of control. Women who express sexuality too freely are labeled as promiscuous. Those who repress it are called cold or broken. In both cases, sexuality becomes a means of disciplining behavior. Even the commodification of sex is political. Pornography, sex work, advertising, all these industries shape public perceptions of what is desirable, normal, or powerful. They often reinforce racial, gender, and class hierarchies. Who is eroticized? Who is degraded? Who profits? These are not personal questions, they are political ones. And yet this doesn't mean sex is always oppressive. On the contrary, many theorists argue that reclaiming sexual agency is a deeply political act. To love who you want, to express your desires without shame, to define your own boundaries, these acts challenge dominant systems. They disrupt the scripts written for your body. Sex, then, is not a neutral act occurring in a vacuum. It is a stage where power, identity, consent, and resistance play out. To understand this is not to kill the joy of sex. It's to recognize that joy, too, can be radical. Pleasure that defies norms, love that crosses boundaries, intimacy that affirms freedom. All these are acts of political defiance. To have sex is to act, to choose how, when, with whom, and to do so consciously is to engage not only the body, but the entire structure that surrounds it. Pleasure is fleeting, suffering is constant. Arthur Schopenhauer believed that existence is defined not by joy, but by suffering, and that pleasure, far from being a positive force in its own right, is merely a temporary absence of pain. In his bleak but piercing worldview, pain is the rule and pleasure is the brief exception. According to Schopenhauer, all life is driven by the will to live, a blind, ceaseless striving. This will manifests as desire. We want food, love, success, security. But as soon as we attain what we desire, the satisfaction fades, and a new craving takes its place. This endless cycle means that pleasure is never sustained. It's just a pause in the otherwise continuous pursuit of something else. Think of hunger. You suffer while hungry. Eating gives pleasure, but only because it relieves the suffering. Once full, pleasure disappears and is replaced by neutrality or even discomfort. The moment of enjoyment is short-lived, and worse, boredom quickly follows, which is itself a form of suffering. In this way, Schopenhauer saw pleasure as negative, the momentary cessation of a negative state, not something that builds a lasting sense of well-being. Pain, by contrast, is much more enduring. Physical injury, illness, heartbreak, grief, anxiety, these conditions can persist for hours, days, or years. They demand attention. They shape behavior. They dominate memory. Pain is sticky. Pleasure is slippery. This imbalance has deep implications. If pleasure is fleeting and suffering is constant, then the optimistic philosophies that promise happiness through virtue, reason, or social progress are lying. Schopenhauer believed that most human activities, work, ambition, religion, even art, are strategies to cope with this fundamental imbalance. We keep ourselves busy to avoid facing the futility of our pleasures and the inevitability of our pain. Nietzsche would later critique Schopenhauer's pessimism, arguing instead that suffering could be transformative, even meaningful. But he too acknowledged that suffering is more authentic than pleasure. Pain strips away illusions. It exposes what we are. It demands response. Pleasure, while valuable, rarely teaches us anything lasting. Modern psychology supports this to an extent. Studies show that while pleasurable experiences provide temporary boosts in mood, people often return to a baseline level of happiness shortly after. Meanwhile, trauma and chronic stress can fundamentally alter the brain and shape long-term behavior. This doesn't mean life is unlivable, but it does challenge the myth that we are made for happiness. Schopenhauer thought the wisest response was not to chase pleasure, but to reduce suffering through compassion, art, asceticism, and deep introspection. The goal is not joy, but relief. Pleasure is a flicker, suffering is a flame. And to live well, we must learn not how to maximize the flicker, but how to endure, understand, and possibly even find wisdom within the fire. Even madness has a structure, and it's cultural. Madness has often been viewed as a rupture, a break from reason, a fall into chaos, or a disease of the mind. But Michel Foucault, in Madness and Civilization, argued something far more radical. Madness is not a universal condition. It is structured, and that structure is cultural. What a society calls madness is deeply tied to its historical, social, and institutional norms. In other words, insanity is not an objective category. It is a construct of power. Foucault traced how the treatment and definition of madness have evolved across centuries. In the Middle Ages, the mad were not necessarily confined. They were often tolerated as part of the social fabric, wandering figures, fools, or mystics. Some were even seen as having special insight or divine connection. Madness existed, but it wasn't pathologized in the modern sense. Everything changed with the Enlightenment. As reason became the dominant social value, madness came to be seen as its opposite, as dangerous, irrational, and disruptive. This shift wasn't just intellectual, it was institutional. The so-called Great Confinement began in the 17th century, when vast numbers of people, many of them poor, eccentric, or socially deviant, were locked away in asylums, not necessarily because they were insane, but because they didn't fit. From there, the medicalization of madness began. Psychiatry emerged as a discipline that claimed to diagnose and treat mental illness. But Foucault asked, who defines these categories? Who decides what behaviors are irrational or unacceptable? The answer, he suggested, lies not in science, but in power and cultural values. Madness became a label applied to those who deviated from the norms, whether social, sexual, economic, or moral. This doesn't mean mental suffering isn't real, but it means the way we understand and respond to it is not neutral. The boundaries of madness are drawn by culture, and those boundaries shift over time. Homosexuality, for instance, was once classified as a mental disorder. So were women's reproductive cycles. So was disobedience in children. What we now see as variation or resistance was once seen as illness. Even the architecture of psychiatric institutions reflects this structuring of madness. The use of isolation, surveillance, medication, and categorization mirrors broader social efforts to discipline behavior. Madness isn't just something treated, it's something organized, managed, and contained. This philosophy challenges us to rethink how we view those labeled as mad. Are they broken, or are they speaking in a language we've been trained not to understand? Are they ill, or are they reacting in extreme ways to a society that itself may be dysfunctional? Madness, in this light, is not just individual, it's political. It exposes the cracks in the system, and that's why society is so eager to control it. Because the truly mad, in Foucault's world, may not be those locked away, but those who decide what madness is. Morality doesn't protect, it pacifies. We are taught to see morality as a shield, something that protects individuals and societies from chaos, harm, and cruelty. But Friedrich Nietzsche flips this idea on its head. In his view, morality doesn't protect, it pacifies. It doesn't cultivate strength or virtue. It domesticates human instincts, tames desire, and keeps the herd in line. Morality, far from being a guide to the good life, is a tool of control. Nietzsche argued that most of what we call morality today stems from what he called slave morality. This is a system built not by the strong, but by the weak, those who could not assert power directly, and so developed a moral code that demonized the powerful. In slave morality, traits like obedience, humility, and suffering are praised. Strength, pride, ambition, and sensuality are condemned as sinful or dangerous. Why? Because slave morality pacifies those who might otherwise rise above the collective. It turns lions into sheep. It teaches the exceptional individual to feel guilt for their strength and to suppress their instincts in favor of conformity. The result is not a just society, but a tamed one. This pacification is reinforced through institutions, religion, education, law, all of which elevate moral values that promote stability over vitality. Turn the other cheek. Love your enemy. Blessed are the meek. These sound noble, but Nietzsche saw them as strategies to suppress power and to make the masses easier to manage. Modern liberal morality continues this tradition, often in subtler ways. It teaches that equality is always good, that tolerance is always right, that selfishness is always wrong. But these blanket statements often serve to suppress complexity, nuance, and legitimate expressions of individuality. They promote moral consensus over moral courage. This doesn't mean Nietzsche advocated for cruelty or nihilism. His critique is not about destroying morality, but about creating new values. He believed that the highest form of life is not one that obeys, but one that creates, one that invents its own code, rooted in life-affirming instincts rather than fear or guilt. This is the path of the Übermensch, the one who transcends inherited morality and crafts a personal ethic grounded in strength, joy, and creativity. In this light, morality is not inherently virtuous. It is a technology of domestication. It teaches people not to act justly, but to obey, not to think deeply, but to submit. Its purpose is not to elevate, but to neutralize. If you want to be truly free, Nietzsche says, you must ask, is this morality protecting me or pacifying me? Is it helping me grow or keeping me small? Because the greatest threat to the herd is not immorality. It's the individual who dares to rise above it. Every cure is just a new form of control. Cures are supposed to be liberating. They promise to remove suffering, restore normalcy, and bring people back to health. But Michel Foucault challenges this comforting narrative. In his view, every cure is just a new form of control. Healing and helping, especially in institutional contexts, are often ways of disciplining behavior, enforcing norms, and managing deviation. The cure doesn't just eliminate illness, it produces conformity. This is most evident in the history of psychiatry. Asylums were created not only to treat mental illness, but to isolate and neutralize individuals who disrupted the social order. The development of psychiatric categories, schizophrenia, hysteria, depression, coincided with the rise of social norms about how one should think, act, and feel. Once a person is labeled, the system doesn't just aim to help them. It redefines who they are, what they can say, and how they must live. Foucault showed that the line between therapy and discipline is thin. Treatments like medication, talk therapy, and institutionalization all serve to realign individuals with dominant expectations. A well person is often just someone who fits back into the machine. They go to work, follow rules, and speak in socially approved ways. The goal isn't freedom, it's functionality. Even in medicine more broadly, cures often come with surveillance. Consider how healthcare systems monitor bodies through charts, diagnoses, and risk profiles. Vaccinations, fitness metrics, diet plans, these may be beneficial, but they also represent an ever-expanding network of biopolitical control. Your body becomes a site of management, your choices filtered through algorithms and guidelines. This extends to social cures as well. Think of addiction programs, prison rehabilitation, or school interventions. These initiatives are rarely about empowering individuals. They are about restoring order, making people less disruptive, more compliant, more productive. The language of care masks the deeper motive, control. Feminist and queer theorists have echoed this concern. Attempts to cure gender nonconformity or correct sexual orientation were historically justified in therapeutic terms. But these cures were violent, not healing. They were acts of erasure, and even today, pathologizing certain behaviors or identities serves to protect the norm rather than the person. Foucault's point is not that all cures are evil or malicious. It's that we must ask, who defines the illness? Who decides what is healthy? Who benefits when someone is cured? Because the promise of a cure often comes with conditions. You can be helped, but only if you comply. You can be free, but only in a way that fits the system. Every cure carries with it a logic of normalization, categorization, and regulation. True liberation, then, may not come from being cured, but from questioning what we're being cured of and why. Because sometimes the illness is resistance, and the cure is obedience. Human beings are not rational, they're willful animals. For centuries, Western philosophy has idolized reason as the defining trait of human nature. From Plato to Descartes, rationality was framed as the highest function of the soul, the light that separates us from animals. But philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche turned that idea upside down. In his view, human beings are not fundamentally rational. They are willful, instinct-driven creatures, guided more by desires, fears, and unconscious impulses than by reason. At the core of Nietzsche's critique is the concept of the will to power. He believed that every living being is driven not by logic or morality, but by an underlying, often unconscious drive to assert, expand, and dominate. Human beings may speak the language of reason, but beneath that is the language of impulse, the craving for survival, superiority, love, attention, or meaning. Reason is a tool, not a master. We use it to justify what our instincts have already chosen. Think of how people form beliefs. We like to imagine we arrive at our views through careful reflection and evidence. But studies in psychology and behavioral economics show the opposite. People often make snap judgments and then rationalize them after the fact. The function of reason becomes post hoc explanation, not decision-making. Even our moral behavior is often instinctual. Neuroscience has revealed that moral intuitions about fairness, harm, or loyalty arise in the emotional centers of the brain long before the rational mind gets involved. We feel before we think. We react, and then we build a narrative to explain our reaction. And that narrative feels true, but it was written by the animal within. Nietzsche believed that this realization should not shame us. It should liberate us. To accept that we are willful animals is to shed the false expectations of perfect rationality and moral purity. It means embracing the body, the instincts, the passions, not suppressing them in favor of abstract ideals. This doesn't mean reason has no value, but it must be seen for what it is, a servant of the will, not its ruler. When reason tries to deny the instincts altogether, it doesn't produce enlightenment. It produces repression, guilt, and weakness. True strength comes from integrating reason with instinct, not using one to destroy the other. Human beings are complex. They are not calculators. They are not saints. They are not even consistent. They are wild, longing, fearful, creative, contradictory, and often irrational. And any philosophy that forgets that, any system that tries to reduce us to logic or rules, is doomed to fail. Reality is interpreted, never known. Friedrich Nietzsche famously said, "There are no facts, only interpretations." This was not a denial of physical reality, but a profound statement about the way human beings relate to the world. According to this view, reality is never directly known. It is always interpreted. What we call knowledge is a perspective shaped by language, culture, power, and experience. To understand this, imagine looking at a painting. 10 people might describe it in 10 different ways. None of them are wrong, but each sees something different based on their background, training, mood, and expectations. Reality, like the painting, exists, but our access to it is always mediated by interpretation. Even science, often hailed as the gold standard of objectivity, works within interpretive frameworks. A physicist doesn't just look at the universe, they apply mathematical models, theoretical assumptions, and conceptual lenses. The data is interpreted through paradigms, and those paradigms shift over time. What was real in Newton's world was redefined in Einstein's, and even Einstein's universe may be reinterpreted by future minds. Nietzsche argued that this interpretive nature of reality extends to morality, politics, religion, and even identity. There is no moral truth floating in the sky. There is no cosmic book of good and evil. What we call morality is a historical construction, a set of values created, enforced, and passed down through culture. It reflects human needs and desires, not eternal law. Language itself is a system of interpretation. Every word is a symbol, a simplification. The moment we label something, we reduce its complexity. We turn the infinite shades of human experience into categories. Love, anger, justice, truth. These are useful tools, but they are not mirrors of reality. They are maps, not the territory. This doesn't mean all interpretations are equally valid. Some are more useful, more coherent, more compassionate, but even the most refined understanding is still an interpretation, a frame, not the absolute picture. Postmodern thinkers like Foucault and Derrida expanded on this, showing how power influences interpretation. The dominant interpretation becomes truth, not because it is the most accurate, but because it is the most enforced. Institutions, media, education, they don't just reflect reality. They shape how we see it. This philosophy invites humility. It warns us against dogmatism. If reality is interpreted, then we must constantly question our lenses. What are we not seeing? What assumptions are we making? What narratives have we inherited without scrutiny? To say that reality is interpreted is not to embrace relativism. It is to acknowledge the richness and complexity of existence, and to remain open to the possibility that our current interpretation is just one version of the story. The philosopher should be a destroyer, not a teacher. The image of the philosopher as a wise, serene teacher calmly transmitting knowledge to eager students is deeply ingrained in our culture. But Friedrich Nietzsche's proposed a different, far more radical role. The philosopher should be a destroyer, not a mere educator. Not someone who comforts with truth, but someone who shatters illusions. Not a preserver of tradition, but a breaker of idols. To understand this, consider Nietzsche's view of philosophy itself. He believed that most so-called philosophers were not thinkers, but system builders, people who created elaborate metaphysical structures to soothe humanity's fear of chaos and mortality. From Plato's realm of perfect forms to Kant's moral imperatives, these systems offered certainty, order, and purpose. But Nietzsche saw them as fictions, beautiful lies designed to make life feel less terrifying. The true philosopher, in Nietzsche's view, is someone who has the courage to face the abyss, to look into the chaos of existence without flinching. This means challenging every sacred value, every inherited truth, every moral certainty. It means asking dangerous questions. What if good and evil are just constructs? What if truth is a function of power? What if God is dead and we killed him? This is why Nietzsche described himself as a philosopher with a hammer. He wasn't building a temple, he was smashing one. And he believed this destruction was not an end in itself, but a precondition for creation. You cannot build new values until you dismantle the old ones. You cannot become free until you expose the chains. The destroyer is not a nihilist. They do not tear down because they hate life. They destroy because they love it too fiercely to let it be caged by lies. They know that to live authentically means to strip away the inherited stories and face existence as it truly is, raw, uncertain, and terrifyingly free. This role is not comfortable. The philosopher-destroyer will be hated, feared, misunderstood. Socrates was executed. Spinoza was excommunicated. Nietzsche himself was dismissed as mad. But their legacy endures because they refused to be teachers of comfort. They provoked. They disturbed. They exposed. Teaching in this light becomes secondary. The true task is not to provide answers, but to unsettle the questions. Not to offer shelter, but to tear off the roof and expose the sky. Not to soothe, but to awaken. The philosopher-destroyer is a rare figure because most people seek affirmation, not transformation. But without destruction, there can be no rebirth. Without fire, no clearing. And without the hammer, the idols remain standing. Your thoughts are not yours. They are echoes of power. We like to imagine our thoughts as our own, unique, self-generated, private. But Michel Foucault and other critical theorists would argue that most of what we think has been shaped, sculpted, and implanted by forces far beyond us. In truth, your thoughts are not entirely yours. They are echoes of power. This doesn't mean that someone is secretly pulling your mental strings. It means that from birth you've been immersed in systems of discourse, language, institutions, norms, and ideologies that subtly but powerfully determine what you can think, what you're allowed to say, and what even seems possible. Your thoughts emerge not from a vacuum, but from structures of power that predate you. Take language. Every word you use carries assumptions. The way we talk about gender, race, politics, sanity, success, all of it is filtered through centuries of cultural construction. We don't just describe the world with words, we are taught how to see the world through them. Language isn't a mirror, it's a framework, and one that's been shaped by those who control media, education, religion, and law. Think about education. You go to school thinking you're being taught knowledge, but what you're really receiving is a template. How to behave, what's acceptable, which questions are safe, and which are off limits. The curriculum is never neutral. It reflects the priorities of the society and the ruling ideology. You're not just learning facts, you're learning how to think inside a cage that feels like freedom. Even your internal voice, your conscience, your sense of right and wrong, is not born purely from you. Foucault would say that you've internalized authority. Society doesn't need to watch you all the time if it's already implanted a watchman in your head. You police yourself, you censor yourself, and you think it's your own decision. Advertising, entertainment, political rhetoric, all of it pushes thoughts into your mind that seem natural but are engineered to serve particular interests. Why do you want to be successful in a certain way? Why do you consider some relationships valid and others not? Why do you think of some people as civilized and others as criminal? These judgments don't spring from pure logic. They are echoes, reverberations of power speaking through you. Even rebellion is often pre-scripted. When you think you're being radical or independent, you may still be playing a role that the system allows, anticipates, and even absorbs. Power is not just repressive, it's productive. It creates the very categories through which you imagine resistance. This doesn't mean thinking is futile, but it does mean that real freedom starts with suspicion, with the willingness to interrogate where your thoughts come from, to ask, whose voice is this? Who taught me this value? What am I not allowed to question? Because only by tracing the echoes back to their source can you begin to think for yourself, not in isolation, but in awareness. Hope is a drug for the spiritually weak. Hope is often praised as a virtue, even a lifeline. In the face of suffering or uncertainty, we're told to hold on to hope, to believe that things will get better. But certain philosophers, especially Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, viewed hope not as strength, but as a dangerous illusion, even a form of spiritual dependency. In this view, hope is a drug for the spiritually weak, a way of numbing oneself to reality rather than facing it. Nietzsche called hope the worst of all evils because it prolongs suffering. It keeps people invested in systems that oppress them, relationships that drain them, ideologies that betray them. Hope seduces with the promise of tomorrow, distracting from the pain and responsibility of today. It pacifies rather than empowers. It says, wait, it will get better, instead of act, change it, or accept it as it is. Hope often functions as a psychological crutch. Rather than confronting the fact that life may be meaningless, that suffering is inherent, or that no justice is guaranteed, people turn to hope like a sedative. It keeps them passive. They wait for salvation, for redemption, for some external force to make sense of it all. In this way, hope becomes a form of dependency, a denial of the tragic dimension of existence. Schopenhauer saw hope as another expression of the will to live, the blind striving that causes human misery. Hope is just another desire dressed up as optimism. We hope because we crave. We project fulfillment into the future, and in doing so, we flee the present. But every time hope is deferred, it reinforces the cycle of longing and disappointment. Religions have historically used hope as a powerful control mechanism. The promise of an afterlife, of divine justice, of cosmic meaning. These are hopes offered in exchange for obedience, for endurance, for quiet suffering. As Marx observed, religion can function as the opiate of the masses. Hope numbs the pain, but it also deadens the will to revolt. Even in secular ideologies, hope is often sold to keep people compliant. Hope in the economy, hope in political reform, hope in progress. These narratives often delay action and foster dependence on leaders, parties, or systems that rarely deliver what they promise. People are told to believe, to be patient, to wait. Meanwhile, power consolidates, injustice persists, and meaningful change is postponed. To reject hope in this framework is not to embrace despair, it is to embrace lucidity. It is to see the world as it is, raw, unfair, impermanent, and often indifferent. It is to stop asking the world to deliver something it never promised and never will. Nietzsche called for amor fati, the love of fate. To affirm life not because it will get better, but because it is what it is. No illusions, no bargaining, no opiates. Just clarity, courage, and the freedom that comes from standing fully awake in a world that owes you nothing. To truly see life, you must stop trying to justify it. Human beings are storytellers by nature. We don't just live, we explain, rationalize, and justify. We turn suffering into lessons, tragedy into fate, randomness into destiny. We can't seem to tolerate the idea that life might simply be without purpose, structure, or justice. But certain philosophers argue that to truly see life, we must first stop trying to justify it. Albert Camus, in The Myth of Sisyphus, captured this tension between the human need for meaning and the universe's apparent indifference. He called this the absurd, the confrontation between our desire for purpose and the silent, empty cosmos. When we try to justify life, we are trying to force meaning onto something that may be inherently meaningless. Camus insisted that the highest form of honesty is to see life clearly, not as a moral test, not as a divine plan, not as a narrative with a climax and resolution, but as what it is: unpredictable, chaotic, often cruel, sometimes beautiful, but always unjustified. And rather than flee this realization with religion, ideology, or optimism, he argued that we must learn to live without justification. Friedrich Nietzsche echoed this in his critique of morality and metaphysics. He believed that most systems of meaning were inventions, constructed to comfort us, to regulate behavior, to suppress chaos. Religion says life has a plan. Morality says life has a purpose. Science says life has an order. But Nietzsche asked, what if all of this is just our fear talking? What if we created values and narratives not because they are true, but because they help us cope? This compulsion to justify life leads to the denial of life. We say suffering is for a higher cause, that injustice will be balanced in another realm, that death is not the end. But in doing so, we deny the rawness of experience. We make life conditional, only tolerable if it fits a certain frame. And this prevents us from seeing it in its full intensity. To stop justifying life is not to fall into despair. It is to see it clearly, to look at the world without needing it to make sense, to feel deeply without needing an explanation, to suffer without moralizing it, to love without a reason, to live fully without waiting for permission or ultimate meaning. Camus imagined Sisyphus condemned to roll a boulder for eternity, not as a victim, but as a hero, because in the face of absurdity, he doesn't seek justification. He chooses to keep pushing. And in that choice, there is defiance. There is freedom. To truly see life, you must stop defending it, stop explaining it, stop dressing it up in meanings it doesn't wear. And when you finally drop the need to justify it, you may, for the first time, actually live it. History is not progress, it's repetition under new masks. We often imagine history as a story of linear progress, a slow, steady march from darkness to light, from ignorance to enlightenment, from barbarism to civilization. This idea is deeply comforting. It tells us that things are always getting better. But critical thinkers, from Nietzsche to Hegel to Foucault, have warned that this belief may be a delusion. Beneath the surface of new technologies, new ideologies, and new social structures, history may be repeating itself, just under new masks. Friedrich Nietzsche famously said, "All events recur eternally." His idea of eternal recurrence was not only metaphysical, but metaphorical. History cycles. Human nature doesn't fundamentally change. Power still dominates. The masses still obey. Violence finds new justifications. Systems collapse and are replaced by slightly more refined versions of the same machinery. Modern democracies, for example, pride themselves on being more evolved than past monarchies or empires. But many of the underlying structures remain. Instead of divine right, we have corporate lobbying. Instead of kings, we have influencers and billionaires. Instead of military conquest, we have economic imperialism. The costumes have changed, but the power dynamics often look the same. Michel Foucault argued that institutions like prisons, schools, and hospitals evolved not to become more humane, but to become more efficient at control. Punishment became reform. Surveillance became safety. Indoctrination became education. Progress, in many cases, is just the refinement of domination into forms that are easier to justify. Wars, too, are repackaged. We no longer fight holy wars, we fight for freedom or human rights. But the machinery of war, propaganda, dehumanization, collateral damage remains intact. The language changes. The weapons change. But the underlying pattern, the cycle of conflict, justification, and moral superiority repeats. Even cultural movements, which claim to be revolutionary, often mimic the very systems they oppose. New ideologies often replace old dogmas with fresh ones. Each generation believes it has transcended the past, only to repeat its errors with different slogans. As George Orwell suggested, revolutions often end up mirroring the regimes they overthrow. This philosophy isn't nihilistic, it's diagnostic. To recognize that history is repetition is not to give up on change, but to stop being naive about it. Progress is not guaranteed. It must be fought for, maintained, and interrogated constantly. And part of that interrogation involves asking, what in our world today is simply the past in disguise? To believe that history is always moving forward is to become blind to its circularity. To see repetition beneath progress is to develop historical consciousness, not as comfort, but as a form of vigilance. The will is like a blind demon pushing you through life. Arthur Schopenhauer viewed life through a profoundly pessimistic lens, and at the heart of his philosophy is the concept of the will, a blind, unconscious, irrational force that drives all living things. According to him, the will is not something we control. It is something that controls us. It is like a demon, blindly pushing us forward, compelling us to act, strive, suffer, and survive, without reason and without end. Schopenhauer believed that this will is the essence of everything. It's not just in human beings, but in animals, plants, and even the movements of the cosmos. It doesn't think, it doesn't plan, it just wants to exist, to continue, to expand. In humans, the will manifests as desire. But the tragedy is that desire is never satisfied. The moment we fulfill one urge, another arises. Hunger, lust, ambition, anxiety. It's all the will expressing itself through us. We are puppets, animated by a force that doesn't care about our happiness. We might think we're chasing love, truth, or meaning, but behind all of it is the same blind urge. The will doesn't care if we're fulfilled. It just wants us to keep moving. Even suicide, Schopenhauer noted, doesn't escape the will. It's the will turning against itself, still acting, still reacting. This view is deeply unflattering. It strips away the idea that humans are rational, noble beings. It paints us instead as driven animals, trapped in a loop of craving and dissatisfaction. Pleasure is fleeting, pain is constant. And the will ensures that we are always yearning, never resting. This is why Schopenhauer saw art, philosophy, and asceticism as the only partial escapes. In moments of deep contemplation or aesthetic experience, we step outside the grasp of the will. We observe instead of strive. We stop being slaves to desire, briefly, but these moments are rare. Most of the time, we are dragged through life by a force we can neither see nor resist. Friedrich Nietzsche would later build on this idea with his concept of the will to power, a more dynamic, life-affirming version of Schopenhauer's will. But even Nietzsche acknowledged that we are not in control. We are carried by a force greater than ourselves. What we call choice is often just the will disguised as reason. To live under the will is to be possessed, not by gods or spirits, but by biology, instinct, and cosmic inertia. The question then becomes, how do we respond? Do we deny the will, like Schopenhauer? Do we affirm it, like Nietzsche? Or do we simply acknowledge its presence and try to make meaning despite it? Because whether we want it or not, the will keeps pushing. What we call madness may be a form of freedom. Madness has long been associated with disorder, danger, and disease, a deviation from the norm that must be treated, corrected, or silenced. But Michel Foucault and others challenge this view. They suggest that what we call madness is not necessarily an illness. It may, in fact, be a form of freedom, a rebellion against the constraints of reason, conformity, and institutional power. Foucault's Madness and Civilization traces how societies have historically constructed madness, not as a medical fact, but as a social category. In medieval times, the mad were often seen as holy, touched by divine insight or tragic wisdom. They were not locked away. They were allowed to roam, sometimes feared, sometimes revered. But with the Enlightenment came the Age of Reason, and madness was redefined as the enemy of rational order. Institutions like asylums emerged not merely to care for the mentally ill, but to contain those who threatened the social fabric. Madness became a label for those who didn't fit: poets, rebels, women, the poor, the eccentric. Their thoughts weren't just strange, they were dangerous, because they refused to obey the dominant logic. In this sense, madness is a kind of exile, but also a kind of escape. To go mad, in a world obsessed with control, may be to refuse the lie. It may be to see through the facade of normalcy, to reject the prison of routine, to speak truths that society cannot tolerate. Madness, then, becomes a language without translation, and therefore feared. Artists, mystics, and visionaries have often been dismissed as mad. Van Gogh, Nietzsche, Artaud. Their visions defied convention. Their intensity broke the limits of acceptable thought. Yet their madness revealed something real about suffering, beauty, transcendence. They weren't irrational. They were beyond the rational, beyond what the world could contain. Even today, mental health is often framed in terms of productivity and conformity. A healthy mind is one that can work, obey, fit in. But what if mental divergence isn't always dysfunction? What if it's a form of resistance, a refusal to adapt to a sick society? Some contemporary voices argue that trauma, neurodivergence, and so-called disorders are not merely defects, but responses to intolerable conditions. To see madness as freedom is not to romanticize suffering. It's to reframe the narrative. Instead of asking how to fix the mad, we might ask, what are they reacting to? What are they trying to escape? What do they see that we do not? In a world that rewards numbness, routine, and obedience, madness might be a flash of wild truth, a refusal to conform to a world that is itself mad. And so, the question turns inward. Is the mad person broken, or are they breaking through? True freedom begins when you stop needing purpose. The modern world is obsessed with purpose. We're told to find it in careers, relationships, beliefs, movements. The absence of purpose is seen as dangerous, a path to depression, apathy, or nihilism. But what if the very need for purpose is the chain? What if true freedom begins when you stop needing purpose? This idea flips the dominant narrative. Most philosophical systems, from religion to secular humanism, are built around some notion of telos or end goal. Life must mean something. We must be going somewhere. But philosophers like Albert Camus, Friedrich Nietzsche, and certain strains of Eastern thought offer a different path, the path of liberation through detachment from meaning. Albert Camus called life absurd, not because it is dark or cruel, but because we constantly ask it to provide a justification it simply cannot give. We want life to make sense. We want suffering to serve a purpose. But the universe is silent. There is no cosmic judge, no final destination. Camus said that to demand purpose from life is like asking a rock to explain your dreams. The mismatch creates the absurd. Nietzsche too dismantled inherited purposes, religious, moral, and metaphysical. He gave them as the residue of fear, as crutches for people too anxious to face a world without a guiding hand. He wrote that the great task was not to discover meaning, but to create it. But even that creation, in its highest form, is not clung to as a lifeline. It's danced with, played with. Purpose becomes aesthetic, not metaphysical. To stop needing purpose is to stop negotiating with life. It's to stop asking, what's in it for me? And instead say, this is it. Now what? It's not despair, it's a kind of lucid joy. You are no longer driven by the anxiety of missing out on your true path, because you've realized that there is no path, just walking. In Zen Buddhism, this takes the form of detachment from ego and future. The moment is all there is. The need for purpose is seen as a trick of the mind, a product of desire, fear, and illusion. Enlightenment is not found in fulfilling a mission, but in realizing that the self who seeks the mission is itself a fiction. This perspective offers a strange but profound liberation. Without needing purpose, you are free to act without burden, free to love, to create, to endure, without always needing a reason. You're no longer a character in a story, you're simply being. And in that being, you find space to breathe. When you stop needing purpose, you don't become empty. You become unbound. Ethics is often disguised cowardice. Ethics is generally seen as the highest form of human behavior, choosing what's right over what's easy, sacrificing selfish desires for moral good. But there's a more cynical view, advanced by philosophers like Nietzsche, that challenges this reverence. It suggests that ethics is often not courage, but cowardice in disguise, a system of values constructed by the weak to constrain the strong, and followed by many to avoid risk, responsibility, and change. Friedrich Nietzsche saw this clearly in his critique of slave morality. He argued that the ethical codes upheld by most societies are not the result of noble reasoning, but the resentment of the powerless. When people can't act with strength or assert their will, they create a system in which restraint is praised, strength is vilified, and obedience is saintly. What we call ethical behavior is often just the fear of acting. Think of how often morality is used to avoid confrontation. Rather than fight injustice head-on, people retreat into ethical platitudes. Let's not stoop to their level. Two wrongs don't make a right. Or, be the bigger person. These might sound noble, but they can also function as excuses for inaction. Ethics becomes a shield, not a sword. Even on a personal level, ethics can hide fear. How often do people avoid making hard decisions, quitting a job, ending a relationship, speaking an uncomfortable truth, because they claim it would be wrong? In reality, it's not wrong, it's uncomfortable, and ethics becomes the language we use to justify our paralysis. Nietzsche argued that true morality, the morality of the strong, is based on affirmation, not fear. It doesn't hide behind rules. It creates values based on what enhances life, power, and creativity. The strong individual doesn't ask, "Is this allowed?" but "Is this authentic? Is this mine?" This is not cruelty, it's moral ownership. Consider how institutional ethics often work. Governments, corporations, religious institutions, they all have codes of ethics. But these codes often serve to protect the system, not the individual. Whistleblowers are punished. Dissenters are silenced. Ethical rules create predictability and control, but they rarely encourage courage or truth. This philosophy doesn't suggest that all ethics are cowardly, but it urges us to ask, whose ethics are these? What fear are they hiding? What action are they preventing? Because many so-called moral choices are just the path of least resistance, cloaked in righteousness. To act ethically should require bravery. It should mean facing your own shadow, not just obeying external rules. But when ethics becomes a substitute for confrontation, a justification for weakness, or a ritual of social approval, it ceases to be noble. It becomes cowardice with a halo. To master yourself, you must first betray what made you. Self-mastery is one of the oldest goals in philosophy. From the Stoics to Nietzsche to existentialists, the idea of gaining control over your own mind, instincts, and destiny has been central to what it means to live a meaningful life. But there's a painful truth hidden beneath this goal. To master yourself, you must first betray what made you. The self is not born in a vacuum. It is shaped by parents, schools, religions, cultures, languages. From the moment you're born, you're fed scripts: how to behave, what to value, who to be. You're praised for obedience, rewarded for conformity, punished for deviance. And before you even realize it, your personality is a patchwork of external expectations. To be yourself is often a lie. What people call self is usually just a reflection of their upbringing and environment. So to truly master yourself, to become a person of authentic will, you must first confront the uncomfortable task of betraying the systems that constructed you. This betrayal is not cruel or petty. It's philosophical. It means questioning the very foundations of your identity. It means asking, do I really believe this, or was I taught to believe it? Is this value mine or inherited? Is this goal something I desire or something someone else planted in me? Nietzsche called this process self-overcoming. It's not about rejecting your past out of resentment. It's about moving beyond it. The snake must shed its skin. The artist must destroy old work. The hero must leave home. Betrayal becomes the act of severing the cord that keeps you dependent. But this is painful. It means disappointing people. It means stepping outside comfort. It means letting go of the very identity that once made you feel safe or accepted. And yet, without that betrayal, you remain a servant to your origins, not the master of your future. Carl Jung described a similar process in individuation, the psychological journey of integrating the unconscious, especially the shadow. This path often leads through conflict with the ego's current identity. You must betray who you thought you were to become who you really are. This idea also echoes in spiritual traditions. In Buddhism, the ego must die. In Christianity, the old self must be crucified. In myth, the hero must abandon the familiar and descend into the unknown. Betrayal is not a flaw in the journey. It is the journey. To master yourself means to step into the fire of transformation. And that fire often burns the bridges behind you. You can't carry everything with you. You can't honor all your loyalties. You must choose. And that choice is always an act of betrayal against the past version of you. But in that betrayal lies freedom. In that shedding lies truth. And only then can you say, "This is who I am, not who I was told to be," because only then are you truly your own. Life isn't a gift, it's a sentence. The phrase, "life is a gift," is a cornerstone of modern optimism. It's used to comfort, inspire, or silence complaints. But what if that phrase is more propaganda than truth? For many thinkers, especially Schopenhauer, Cioran, and the darker currents of existentialism, life isn't a gift, it's a sentence. Not in the poetic sense of a beautiful passage, but in the penal sense. A punishment you didn't choose, a condition you're forced to endure. Arthur Schopenhauer wrote that to be born is to begin suffering. Life for him was not a joyous opportunity, but a constant tension between desire and dissatisfaction. The moment a need is fulfilled, a new one arises. Pleasure is merely the temporary absence of pain, not a positive experience in itself. And death, far from being the ultimate enemy, is the only true escape. Think of it this way. You didn't ask to be born. You were thrust into existence by chance, into a body you didn't design, in a world you didn't create, governed by rules you didn't vote for. You're compelled to play this game, to survive, to strive, to suffer, and eventually to die. What part of that feels like a gift? Emil Cioran took this further. He wrote that birth was a calamity, and that the greatest favor we could do for someone was not to create them. He didn't mean this in a bitter or personal sense. He meant it philosophically. Consciousness is a curse. To be aware is to suffer. Rocks don't despair. Plants don't contemplate mortality. But humans, we know we will die. We know our loved ones will suffer. We carry the burden of awareness. Religious and secular systems try to mask this with meaning. Religion says life has divine purpose. Capitalism says you can buy fulfillment. Psychology says you can be well-adjusted. But all of these systems rely on the assumption that life is worth it. Cioran and Schopenhauer challenge that directly. What if life is not something to be grateful for, but something to endure with dignity? This doesn't mean giving in to despair. In fact, many who hold this view argue for a deeper form of strength, lucid endurance. If life is a sentence, then the task is not to pretend it's a party, but to find ways to survive it with clarity, with honesty, maybe even with style. Not out of hope, but out of integrity. To see life as a sentence is to strip away illusions. It's to reject the forced gratitude that society demands. And in that rejection, you may find a strange kind of freedom. The freedom to feel what you really feel, to live without pretense, and perhaps to make peace with the absurdity of being here at all.